Stop consuming animals.
I speak aside what is recognized as the border between reason and sanity. I consider it a measure of my humanity to be written off by the...
You're listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. On this episode, we're talking about nailing Descartes to the wall. Liquid meat is still murder. Track 2 on Let's Talk More Rock. We're also going to chat a little bit about the first version of the song, Firestorm My Ass, recorded during the first and abandoned attempt at recording Let's Talk More Rock. And for those of you keeping track, this is our 6th Let's Talk episode.
Awesome. Well, to me, one of the most important details about Let's Talk More Rock is the fact that the band tried to record this album twice and got sent home because they showed up with only 4 songs done. So they drove like 3,000 miles from Winnipeg to California. And we're like totally not ready to record this record. And, you know, I could be wrong here potentially, but on the Where Quantity is Job Number 1 CD compilation from G7, there are 4 tracks that they made it through in the first recording session. And that is Contest Song, the one that has no vocals, Firestorm My Ass, Refusing to Be a Man with the additional verse at the end, and also a different version of Resisting Tyrannical Government. And Chris talks a ton about the first attempt to record this record on his Refusing to Be a Man episode of his Catastrophic Break with Consensus Reality podcast. And I love that story where they talk about the abandoned version of Let's Talk More Rock, because it just shows the youthful, lackadaisical nature that the band took to recording and performing in the early days, which I highly recommend people go back and listen to Chris tell that story because it's really funny. Do you remember that Refusing to Be a Man episode?
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah.
I was shocked to hear how unprepared they were.
Absolutely. I was listening back to that because I have that CD and I have it in my car, and I only have like 9 CDs that I own, and they all live in my 2009 Cars CD changer because it's the only CD player that I have. So I just have the same full CD rack in there, and I never buy more CDs, so they just stay full in there. But I have huge regrets about not talking about the alternate version on our Resisting Tyrannical Government episode that we did a long time ago, because that version has so many nuanced differences. It's also really cool. It's got subtle riff changes, a slightly different vocal delivery. It starts off with some drums instead of launching right into the verse itself. But the bass tone on the abandoned version of Resisting Tyrannical Government and Refusing to Be a Man is way different because it doesn't have that super pingy bass tone that Let's Talk is so famous for. But to me, it's pretty clear that the first versions of these songs are still pretty much in like a demo mode. I was listening to the Firestorm My Ass version of Nailing Descartes, and I've heard a few people say that they like the first versions better, but to me, the versions that made the record are miles better. And my favorite thing about Chris's Patreon podcast is when he shows older versions of songs, like when he busts those demos out and like throws those in the episodes.
What I think is super cool then is hearing different riffs from other songs make them way into like the completely tracks that you would have expected.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was listening to like the Zoocosis episode that he did recently as well. And he showed all the puzzles of trying to sort out that song where they were playing it super fast and then they're playing it super slow and all the versions. So it's really cool. And the version of Firestorm My Ass and Resisting Tyrannical Government, Refusing to Be a Man, like these are done, but the actual done versions they did on the second time are just hugely improved. And, I hope Chris does an episode on Descartes sometime and discusses the revision process between taking it from Firestorm My Ass and turning it into what we know as Nailing Descartes to the Wall, Meat is Still Murder. And, seeing a snapshot of where the band was when they went down to record Let's Talk is so interesting because I get the impression from talking to JP Peters on our Negredo episode that propaganda is far more methodical and organized post Let's Talk when it comes to like the discipline of recording, so that first attempt at making a record seems like it was a huge lesson takeaway, so I think that propaganda learned a lot from failing to walk away from that first session with a completed recording?
Well, Greg, you've already said Descartes a few times already, so let's chat a little bit about the title. René Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. He was a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist, most famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am," and the Cartesian coordinate system, and his book, Meditations on First Philosophy. And in the philosophical divide on how we arrive at knowledge, there's rationalism. It's the idea that knowledge can be arrived at through the use of reason. Then there's empiricism, the idea that knowledge can be arrived at through sense experience. Descartes was one of the most influential continental rationalists. So he said, like, with dreams and illusions, hallucinations, he believed that the senses were therefore untrustworthy. And in an age of confusion, as humans struggled to understand the world around them, with more and more of what they thought they knew being challenged by new findings and theories, Descartes threw out everything he thought he knew, refusing to believe in even the most basic premises before proving them to himself satisfactorily. So in this act of demolition, of destruction, of reconstruction of his beliefs, Descartes felt it would be a waste of time to tear down each idea one by one. Instead, he attacked what he considered to be the very foundation, the idea that sense perception conveys accurate information. So Descartes was disastrously wrong about ideas about non-human animals, which we'll discuss later. But ironically, I think there is some merit in doing some mental housekeeping before learning about things like factory farming and normalized violence against animals and how our individual actions and choices fit in with those systems that were here before us. They'll be here after us, but we can learn more to mitigate cruelty and suffering.
Nice. Well, and what's really cool about this song as well is like similar. So Propaganda has this thing where they're sort of calling out a figure within the world who is well known. So similar to how Propaganda took Sandor Katz to task on Humane Meat, which we discussed about several episodes ago with Lindsay from Frenzel Ram, Propaganda call out the famous Descartes. And now something else that I really like about this song is that it looks inward and it points like a magnifying glass squarely upon the actions of a single person and how they engage with a system that is based on like a systematic death and destruction of sentient living beings and making the informed choice to not participate in that. So something that I really love about this song that I just want to say right off the bat is the opening line of the song is "Stop consuming animals." So that's where track 2 of this record actually begins. Stop consuming animals, spoken over no music. And it's a very purposeful choice. It's a method used by Chris to not have any room for misinterpretation. You know what I mean? Like if you're often listening to a heavy record, you don't always know what's being said because it's oftentimes being like yelled or screamed, or they're over like a really hard piece of performed music. But the idea of just saying "stop consuming animals" before the music even comes in, it's such an interesting choice because before you get to the rock, you literally get talk. So I'm super excited about this episode because it is, the album is less talk, more rock, but here we get talk before the rock. So the other day also I posted on Twitter about how I seem to be compelled to create the longest episodes ever for the shortest songs. So here we have a 64-second song and we have 2 fantastic interviews. So I have no idea how long this episode is going to be, but I'm sure this one's going to be a doozy. But while we're recording it, I don't know how long it's going to be. But we have 2 guests on this episode. So our first guest is Dr. Lauren Corman. Dr. Corman is an environmental sociologist who teaches in the areas of environmental thought, contemporary social theory, and critical animal studies. Dr. Corman's research centralizes anti-racist, anti-colonial, queer, and feminist understandings of social relations and the more than human world, and her scholarship investigates the agency, resistance, and subjectivities of oppressed groups. And Dr. Corman is interested in coalition building across social and environmental justice movements and links her work to larger anti-capitalist analyses and struggles. She's fairly well known for hosting a radio show called Animal Voices for about 10 years. And she has a lot of published scholarship, including an academic book chapter titled, wait for it, Nailing Descartes to the Wall, where she analyzes this propaganda song with a co-author, Surratt Calling, and published as, a book chapter in a book called Rebel Music, Resistance Through Hip Hop and Punk, which came out in 2015 through Information Age Publishing. And interestingly, Chris Hanna and Chuck D both wrote full introductions to the book that Corman's chapter appears in. So Chris Hanna wrote the introduction to Rebel Music.
Yeah, right. I'm like Chuck D. More blown away by that.
I know. So it's really cool. And I went and read Chris's introduction, and it's really good. And if anybody wants to check it out, but the book is expensive. It's an academic press. But if anybody wants to read Chris's introduction and you go to the mega monopolizing publishing related internet store that shall not be named, you can read the introduction that Chris wrote for free by searching Rebel Music, Resistance Through Hip Hop and Punk, and click on the preview function for that book, and you can read Chris's work. But Dr. Corman is currently also working on a text about the cultural histories of particularly vilified animals and their relationships to colonial legacies. Yeah. So,
wow.
I know. So, earlier we said who Descartes was briefly, and Corman's essay introduces a huge reasoning behind this song's title. So I have a little passage that I want to read before we get into our interview with Dr. Corman. Page 2 of her chapter reads, "Propaganda has a knack for describing scenarios that turn the tables on humans by imagining us as victims of the same violence we routinely inflict on other animals. Even the title of this song points to such turning. Descartes is nailed to the wall, not animals, his regular test subjects. Descartes was an influential 17th century philosopher, mathematician, and scientist who theorized the separation between mind and body. You've probably heard his statement, 'I think, therefore I am.' While often celebrated by Western science, his philosophy, known today as Cartesianism, proved most unfortunate for animals. Descartes believed that humans are the only living beings with souls. According to him, because animals lack a soul, then they must lack consciousness, although they have a brain, thus the biological infrastructure to receive images of the world, like an apple or a tree. Without a soul to receive the sense input, animals cannot be aware of or think about their surroundings. For instance, a cat will often respond with excitement to a bird flying outside the window, chattering and fixating on her movements. Rather than this being a conscious experience, Descartes would say that because the cat lacks a soul to receive the image of the bird, she is simply reacting like a machine. Just as one would disassemble a machine to examine its components, Descartes and his contemporaries pulled apart living animals to examine their bodies. They cut open animals to observe their beating hearts, and they burnt, mutilated, and beat them, among other tortures. One eyewitness observed that the Cartesians nailed the poor animals to boards by 4 paws to dissect them while still alive in order to watch the circulation of the blood." So that's the passage from Corman's chapter in that book that I mentioned. And if anybody has the liner notes for Less Talk, More Rock handy, and you go to the animal essay inside the liner notes, you'll see that the animal essay title is called "Animals Are Not Biological Machines," which is exactly what Descartes thought they were. So that's a little preview of what Dr. Lauren Corman and I are going to chat about. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Lauren Corman.
Different species of carnage strewn about the
Dr. Lauren Corman, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thanks for having me on.
I am so delighted to have you. We've had so many back and forth conversations in the recent weeks, and I am so pumped to talk to you about propaganda and to have an awesome conversation for the show. And just to kind of set the stage for our listeners, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself however you see fit to the audience so they can learn who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, my name's Lauren, as you said. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Brock University. And I hosted a radio show called Animal Voices for about a decade, which was one of my first public forays into animal issues. And I know we'll talk more about that. So a lot of people do know me for my animal work through the radio show or through my teaching at Brock University. And one of the things that's been important to me in doing animal work, and as we'll talk about with propaganda, is that animal issues for me have always been interconnected with other issues of oppression. And I'm really grateful for my political roots being in the Winnipeg punk scene. And I'm really glad that I had the chance to work with people through gender studies in my undergrad, and then my master's and my PhD are in environmental studies. And I just connected with people who are doing interesting intersectional and decolonial work that also includes animals. And that's my interest as well.
Awesome. Well, I was a once upon a time a failed PhD student. And so I was sort of on a trajectory to go into the world of higher education like you've done. And so I know that sometimes it's kind of difficult to explain the different, departments and roles within higher ed. And so I'm kind of curious if you can sort of explain the job of being an environmental sociologist and sort of like what your field is about and kind of like how you see some of your research focuses.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a process of rebranding myself. I absolutely hate that terminology, but in the midst of the pandemic, I did some pretty intense soul searching around how I understand myself as an activist and scholar. And in particular, I mean, my work has really been strongly associated with critical animal studies. So in 2009, I was hired at Brock University as the first professor hired anywhere ever to specialize in critical animal studies. And the field of critical animal studies is founded in 2006. So it was still pretty fresh when I was hired. But I had been doing that work of linking animal issues to other issues of environmental and social justice for a long time. And then it just gets called this academic field of critical animal studies. And that's a part of what I'm interested in, because the people that came together to found critical animal studies, they were trying to politicize the field of animal studies, or what some people would call mainstream animal studies. They wanted it more to be in conversation with activism. They wanted a more intersectional focus. They wanted to have an anti-capitalist critique, those sorts of things that resonate with the kinds of political and philosophical commitments that I have. But in the time since I was hired in 2009, I've had a chance to teach critical animal studies and social theory more broadly. And I found it this kind of interesting set of moments where people are trying to lock down a field. And I haven't necessarily always felt comfortable with some of the directions that critical animal studies is going, or I'm not sure if critical animal studies as a term really fits everything that I'm interested in. In particular, I mean, I'm really wanting to take animal issues and locate them more centrally within anti-colonial and decolonial thought. And those are the folks that I'm really in conversation with right now. And I think that critical animal studies really sees its heart as being an intersectional analyses. And I think there's been more of a turn towards including anti-colonial perspectives. But for me, given my background, my master's, my PhDs being in environmental studies, I thought, well, maybe I'll sort of start talking about my work as environmental sociology as a bit bigger umbrella, not abandoning critical animal studies, but maybe wanting to have some broader conversations and to make connections outside of critical animal studies as well.
I'm so interested in how you originally got interested in sociology and environmental sociology and critical animal studies, like, do you have any like sort of stepping stones that sort of set you down this path that you found yourself following for your career?
Well, I would joke to you, I did thank propagandy in my dissertation. So I think propagandy arguably was doing critical animal studies before that was called critical animal studies. I mean, they were, as we'll talk about with the album Let's Talk More Rock, they were always politicizing animal issues in relationship to other issues of oppression and social justice. So there, for me, was this interesting collision between the academic work that I was doing at the University of Manitoba and gender studies, and I was really focused on issues of violence against women, and then the punk scene that was happening in the 1990s in Winnipeg, which was this really fruitful, interesting place where like the intellectual pursuits of the academy weren't seen as divorced from advocacy or activism. One of the central hubs was the Mondragon, which had a bookstore, and the idea that you would read and you would critically think about ideas was integral to the punk scene as I experienced it. And I think I probably have a romanticized view of the punk scene in Winnipeg because I was involved, but I was peripheral. I was pretty hardcore into my studies at that point. But it was this really fruitful ground for me to come into thinking about issues of activism and advocacy. So there was the infrastructure of actually having a space where there was a restaurant. There was like I think it's called the Anarchist Free Zone, the A Zone.
Mm-hmm.
There was this place where people came together and would have discussions about books, and you could go and you could look at what the new AK press releases were, and then you could have your vegan dessert and have an impassioned debate with somebody. And so there was that infrastructure of activism, this collision between the music scenes, the art scenes, the political scenes, and the intellectual scenes in Winnipeg. So that was this really nice complement to the infrastructure that I had through the University of Manitoba. And gender studies at the time in the 1990s was really informed by intersectional thought. And I feel like intersectionality is getting kind of a weird name right now as people pick it up, I think, in these clumsy ways and some useful ways as well. But for me, it was really, intersectionality was about grounding in its original formation in Black feminist thought, which was about trying to address white supremacy within the Western women's movement. And so that was my ground for my interest in politics. And that was what I came out of intellectually, was having that framework. And then I was frustrated because Manitoba was going through a hog boom in the 1990s, and we see the rise of industrial animal agriculture in that province and the decimation of environmental regulations there. And I was really upset by what I saw, and propagandy kind of gave me a soundtrack and some of the analysis to begin to make sense of the kind of intersectional work that I was interested in, questions of violence, and then how that might relate to making sense of what was happening with animals. And I was frustrated because I thought intersectionality really offered us this important toolbox to take apart issues of oppression and to see their interrelationship, so we could kind of talk more broadly about building coalitions and building solidarity. And then even within these sort of really radical intersectional politics, it's still very imbued with humanism. And there was this kind of reluctance or even hostility towards considering the question of the animal as part of an intersectional framework. And to me, it seemed like a reproduction of some of the concerns that people had legitimately been raising about the absences within feminist theoretical and activist frameworks that weren't including various marginalized others, oppressed others. And so to me, it just seemed logical. Why wouldn't we also include animals within that analysis? And then through the years, I was able to come up with a more robust answer to that question.
Awesome. Well, I mean, you caught my eye a long time ago on Twitter and on Instagram because like I have this habit where I just go on Twitter in the evening and search the word propagandy in Twitter and then just start mass liking people's tweets. And I think that that's sort of how I found your work. And it's almost like finding my people, you know what I mean? And so I'm curious about your first introduction to the band, because apparently they've been profoundly inspirational in your thoughts, in your ideas about the world, in your scholarship. And that is so cool because you're not the first professor who's told me that. So what is the origin story for you finding Propaganda? How did they come into your life?
I was dating somebody who introduced me to punk. I mean, this was pre-internet days for the most part. I was in rural Manitoba in the 1990s, and the person that I was dating at the time wanted to introduce me to punk. And so this was actually kind of a cute and nerdy part of the Winnipeg scene, is that people would print out lyrics that, for shows, and you would go and you would like read the lyrics as people are singing them to you. And
interesting.
So this idea that, I mean, I'm not sure how widespread that was practiced, but there were definitely shows where that happened. And so, I was in rural Manitoba. I was outside of Winnipeg, and this person I was dating would write out, by hand, the lyrics to various different political bands like Dead Kennedys, and these mixtapes that I would receive. And Propaganda was, part of that array of punk music that I was given. And I was really looking for something that had a critical edge. And at the time in rural Manitoba, there was like metal. Everybody was listening to Metallica, the old Metallica, and people were big into Pink Floyd and stuff. And I just never had heard anything like Propaganda before. And they gave me this important language to name some of my own experiences. And also they motivated me. I wanted to get smarter when I listened to Propaganda. I was like, who are they talking about? Who are these people? Even we talked about maybe doing the state lottery as the song. And I was stoked to do that because I thought, well, it'll give me a chance to talk about Chomsky.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know who Chomsky was until, this album, Less Talk More Rock, sample Chomsky, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to have the kind of incisive analysis that I thought Propaganda and these other punk heroes that I was into. I wanted to also be hip to that.
Awesome. Well, Propaganda is directly responsible for me finding Chomsky. I think I read Hegemony or Survival immediately after discovering Less Talk More Rock. It had been out for a while, but that was my first introduction to Chomsky as well. And I immediately went out and found this book that I didn't know how to read. And it essentially forced me into figuring out how to dive deeply into texts that were beyond me, but that fascinated me, so that I was motivated to keep going, even though I wasn't really following everything. And so Propaganda did that for me too, as well. They like elevated my intellect, and they gave me this drive to understand some of these really challenging things that are timeless within their lyrics,
Totally. I wanted to be part of that conversation. And the more direct influence that I had is that I went to one of their shows. I think it was shortly after I graduated high school, and it was my first punk show ever. And again, this kind of pairing between activism and intellectual pursuits, or like wanting to enrich your brain, was a part of the scene. They had these info tables lining the show. That was part of was pretty common actually in Winnipeg to do this. I don't know I assume people still do that now, where you can, when I go to Propaganda shows in Toronto, they still do this. They'll have groups there representing various different causes. So it was a chance to see some of the work that was being done in Winnipeg at the time. And there was a group called People Acting for Animal Liberation, and they were playing before the show, they were playing this video of a monkey being vivisected, so being cut open, being experimented on, and this monkey was screaming. And it was a real shocking moment for me. I hadn't even heard the word vivisection before. I remember after that show, it must have been a couple days later, we went to the office of PAL, and they had a pamphlet about vivisection, and it just ruined me. I couldn't believe that this kind of the kind of ignorance I had been dwelling in, really, and that I feel like is foundational to the operation of the Western world, is that so many forms of institutionalized and industrialized large-scale violence are hidden from us. And the animal question and those sorts of issues weren't even part of my landscape at that time, really. I mean, I knew a little bit about factory farming, I suppose, but that was definitely a shocking moment. That for me was the connection between my animal consumption, being an omnivore, and then going vegetarian was after that show.
Nice. Well, when I reached out to you, we originally talked about doing the song State Lottery, as you mentioned, off the Let's Talk More Rock LP. But then as I was reading about some of your work, over the course of the weeks that we've been corresponding to do this, I found that you are like way into the animal critical animal studies and animal liberation writing. And it was so interesting because I recently read your book chapter that you co-authored. Who was your co-author again? I didn't write down the name.
The chapter that I did with Darren Chang?
Or
Surratt Calling.
Surratt Calling.
Early,
yeah. Yeah, so I read that chapter in a 2015 book called Rebel Music, Resistance Through Hip Hop and Punk, specifically about the song Nailing Descartes to the Wall on Let's Talk More Rock. So I'm curious a little bit about the origin of what nailing Descartes to the wall like sort of means to your like life and scholarship, and like how this essay came to exist in the world, because it's so interesting that you have a full academic book chapter about a 64-second song on a record that came out in 1996. I mean, it's really amazing. So I'm curious about the origin of the essay and like what you love about the song Nailing Descartes to the Wall so much.
I tried to give this some thought in advance of this interview, and I couldn't remember, actually. Surratt Calling was one of my grad students at Brock University. She was one of my first grad students who I was working with. She actually just published a book called Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era, all about different forms of animal resistance. So it's very, very cool to see her go on and author a book like that. So I think Surratt and I, we were just running in some of the circles that were doing critical animal studies at the time. And there was this real, and I think there still is this real kind of ambition to try to map the field. And so I think folks that were interested in thinking about the influence of punk music and hip hop on animal consciousness, and that people who are writing about intersectional ideas, I think we were likely approached by those folks and then got to choose what we wanted to write about. And then Propaganda seemed, and that song seemed a good fit, given that album, Let's Talk More Rock, was so influential in my own trajectory, and that I know that was also an important song for Surratt. And that she had found out about it through the radio show that I did, Animal Voices, where we had interviewed Propaganda. Awesome. Yeah, so that's probably how it all started. But like I said, I mean, one of the things that I love about Propaganda is that animal issues are not divisible from other political and social justice issues. And I feel like the framing of animal issues is often done in a very kind of neoliberal way, where there's a real focus on the individual, sort of this question around choice. We want to respect other people's choices to eat meat or not eat meat. And those are important sort of parameters. I understand why people raise that as kind of a question of the individual and trying to respect the choices of individuals. But Propaganda, I think, does different moves in their songs. They want us to think about how animal issues are political issues. There's a politicization of the animal question that I think takes it away from some of the more philosophical debates about morals and individual choice and moves it into a conversation about how is the question of the animal and our treatment of animal related to other social justice issues and environmental destruction and colonialism and capitalism in particular. So I love that about their work. I feel like they had that kind of consciousness that's so clearly articulated in Let's Talk More Rock that I feel like we're just kind of catching up to now in terms of our like the intellectual tradition of critical animal studies.
I love it. Well, I want to get into the lyrics a little bit too, because the essay that you and Surratt wrote is so interestingly structured in the way that it has these like subsections within the chapter that sort of give a heading to different sections within the song. And I really love the way you did it, but I want to break down the title first, Nailing Descartes to the Wall. For anybody out there who's listening who doesn't know, why is Descartes, who is famously known for "I think, therefore I am" in philosophy, why is Descartes cited in the title of this song?
Well, I mean, there's lots of debates about the specifics of what Descartes did and did not do to animals, but it's pretty clear that he was in favor of having animals be cut open without anesthetic. So that would have been something that wasn't around in the 17th century and the 18th century, moving into the 18th century. But the reason why Descartes, I think, is featured in this song is because the Cartesian framework is really about the objectification of animals. It's about a kind of rationalization that animals are machine-like, that we can see them as, their responses as being akin to the kind of mechanics of a clock, and that the Cartesian way of understanding animals is not having souls, of not having the capacity for reason, those sorts of things, that Descartes' model of thinking about non-human animals has a tremendous influence on the rise of vivisection and helps justify vivisection and provides a rationale for vivisection, which has created an incredible harm to animals. And is really contra to like our current understandings and scientific understandings of animals' capacity. So we do know that animals have very rich emotional lives, that they have not only the capacity to feel pain, but in some instances maybe feel pain more intensely or in different ways than humans do. And so the Cartesian framework, we could talk about the specifics. I was reading some of the debates about, did he actually nail dogs to boards? There's a story about that he vivisected his wife's dog to make a point. So I don't think the minutia of what Descartes did or did not do is particularly relevant, except to say that the influence and the frameworks that he helps develop are used then, they're used as kind of tools to rationalize the growing vivisection industry, which still exists today and which still tortures animals today. So that's why I think we need to, even though Descartes was supported, it's not like he's the number one monster. It's that Descartes was resonating with some of the political and philosophical will at the time to use animals in this way, to use them as test subjects, and then to absolve oneself of moral culpability, which I think propaganda continually points to, about like what are the myths and the storytelling and the fantasies that we have to live within to justify this kind of large scale harm, not only to animals but human beings and the earth as well.
That's so interesting. So, of the lyrics, you have a quote in the article that I really liked, and it says, "Nailing Descartes to the wall / liquid meat is still murder is a blistering minute-long wake-up call, shaking us out of our delusions of happy animals frolicking on old MacDonald's farm." And I think that ties into an earlier quote in the book that you cited from a scholar named Noski, who wrote about the animal industrial complex. And I'm curious if you can like sort of shatter the delusion here really quick for our listeners about what that animal industrial complex sort of looks like in our world in 2021.
It's a huge question. I mean,
I know, and I'm really sorry.
The animal industrial complex, I think, is a good way of beginning to name some of that politicization of animals. So it points to similar kinds of complexes people talk about, the prison industrial complex or the military industrial complex. And it's this intersection really in terms of the animal industrial complex between our treatment of animals, how we understand animals, and then the rise of industrialization and the commodification of animals on a scale that we frankly have never seen before. And so this very intense objectification of animals within industries like the vivisection industry or factory farming, that industry is overlaid with a set of power relationships that makes a lot of money for people. It's justified by our ideologies that says that the people and the animals involved in those industries, specifically folks who involved in industrial slaughter, like don't really matter, that their bodies are basically available for us to use. And the industrialization of animal agriculture had wide-scale impacts for animals. We see animals in smaller spaces where they're confined together. So we have battery cages for birds, or we have gestation crates or farrowing crates for pigs. We see this intensification happen through the Industrial Revolution that just becomes more and more so with our new technologies today. So that process, though, that relation of humans, primarily Western white humans, the way of understanding the natural world, non-human animals, is to view them as kind of inert matter that we can use at will. And that kind of framework, that kind of animalization of the animal that Barbara Noske is talking about, that really becomes intensified through the industrialization process, that way of animalizing and stripping animals of their subjecthood or their selfhood, that way of thinking about animals is actually related to how we think about the environment and how we think about various different human groups who are also animalized. So you think about slaughterhouse workers within the animal industrial complex. They are animalized through their work. They're seen as not fully human. They're dehumanized through a very, quick line speeds, through lacerations, through a lot of drug use on the kill floor. We see, increases in violent crimes in communities with slaughterhouses because the guys that are working on the kill floor and in these industrial contexts are being traumatized by the work that they're doing. We see an increase in line speed, under capitalism. Industrial agriculture is all about, increasing efficiency, increasing productivity. And so the idea that you're going to produce more and more animal products means that the speeds on the kill floor are happening always more rapidly. And so the consequences for a largely immigrant, refugee, disenfranchised group of people that are the slaughterhouse workers is that those line speeds mean that they're in increasingly unsafe and dangerous working conditions where the animals maybe aren't getting a proper stun and they're fighting back, and there's just a lot of noise. It's very chaotic. And so that figure of the animal, not only have we kind of stripped animals and said, you're really an object, even though our scientific knowledge says that they're not, they have these full, rich lives, or at least the capacity to. We take the idea of the animal within Western context, and we really apply it to other human groups. And so it's crucial, I would argue, and other people who are doing this work would argue, that the animal, the way that the animal is understood in Western context is actually integral. It's vital to the colonial and capitalist project, where you take the idea of the animal, which is so fucked up and stripped of, all those potential capacities that they have, and we take that kind of debased version of who animals are, and then we regard other human groups as animal-like. And that's part of racist legacies of slavery. It's part of indigenous colonization. It's to regard various different human groups, women as well, trans people, as being more animal-like and less like this white, civilized, cis, straight man that is considered a full human subject under Western civilization. So, I mean, the animal industrial complex is sort of one manifestation of colonial and capitalist legacies. It involves the disruption and displacement of indigenous people. It's involved in taking over of their lands. And it's about hiding this from our public conversations, and then creating an ideological apparatus through people like Descartes and others throughout the years that say that these lives just don't really matter, that they're not of consequence. And that kind of disposability is built into not only our relationship with animals through this Western colonial framework, but that same framework, that same ideological perspective is applied to various different human groups as well. I think that's part of the argument for why we should give a shit about the question of the animal, is to say that that understanding of the animal is vital to understanding other human oppressions too.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So there's so many vivid visuals and, discussions of history of our continent as well, especially over all those descriptions you just gave. I'm swimming in those thoughts at the moment. It's overwhelming. So yes, that question was huge, and thank you for that so much. in the chapter, you break down the lyrics to this song in these, like I mentioned earlier, these subsections. And so the first section that you have is titled Doing Nothing Still Does Something. And this is so interesting because if people do nothing and they just assume that they can't do anything, that is still doing something. And so the opening line that you attach that to is stop consuming animals. I speak outside what is recognized as the border between reason and insanity, but I consider it a measure of my humanity to be written off by the living grades of 1 billion murdered lives. So what is this? How did you divide this into this subsection and attach that subsection to these opening lyrics in the song?
I feel like this is like when we would interview propaganda and we'd be like, how did you come up with this line? And
It's
then
crazy.
they would be like, well,
Well, I wrote it down.
I'm not sure. I think one of the things that's informed my political orientation is that there's no neutral place to be in terms of politics. And this is something that Darren Chang and I wrote recently in an article about the pandemic and meatpacking, is that some of the animal activists who were writing about the pandemic as being an opportunity for us to look at global capitalist commodity chains, in some ways we're not bringing in an anti-racist analysis. And the argument that we make drawing on other people is that there's no place outside of race, like that we're always in those conversations. And I think that as a starting point is kind of what we're getting at with that line, that a kind of non-participation, or the idea that you're not weighing into these questions every day, is just not true. I think we're all making decisions. I think that there's lots of important conversations that we need to have about food justice in general. So I think that, it's very simple to say stop consuming animals or go vegan. And I think there's legitimate concerns that people of color and critical race scholars have asked about who has access to healthy, affordable foods, et cetera. But all of that, sort of those larger debates, while they're important, it doesn't remove our responsibility to grapple with them, right? And so I think that hopefully what the chapter is trying to do and what that line is trying to do is to bring us into a conversation about equity and social justice in the food system more broadly, and to realize that there's no way out of it for any of us. Like, we're all pretty much enmeshed in this system. And so what responsibilities do we have to make individual choices that are more in line with our values, but also to push back against the system that is so devastatingly in such large ways causing violence to humans and animals and the planet. So I think it's really a position against neutrality. It's about kind of an invitation, a more direct invitation into some of those critical conversations, and to know that none of us are absolved from taking a position, that even in your kind of position that you're not making a choice, you're still making a choice. We're all making choices by what we're eating. And so for me, thinking intersectionally, or thinking from an anti-colonial perspective, it would mean also including a very rigorous conversation about how issues of race come into play in regards to the food system. But it doesn't absolve us from having that conversation about who is objectified and commodified under our current system. In itself, as I've mentioned, these systems that are so violent are grounded in capitalist and colonialist legacies that play out today.
Yeah, and I like that in the next section too, where you write about the section is why people are pissed off, and within that section you write about some statistics of what the current animal industrial complex is like today. What are those statistics like in 2021 that you sort of write about in this article that's a couple of years old at this point? Are we still about the same figures for slaughter and the amount of killing that's happening?
Yeah, so I don't have all those statistics right on hand. I think what I give in the chapter is about 700 million animals are killed per year in Canada. I think I said 8 billion for the United States and 56 maybe for globally. And so unfortunately, I mean, despite the rise of veganism and vegetarianism as maybe something that is trendy, is something that I think, hopefully we're learning hopefully to have more critical conversations about sort of how veganism becomes the next kind of health food craze. So that's kind of a separate issue, but globally, one of the things we know is that animal use and consumption is still increasing, and that hasn't really changed, even though there's more in North America, there's more vegetarianism and veganism that's happening. And, one of the things that struck me through the radio show is that, these sorts of animal movements and the vegan movements are really global at this point as well. And despite the very hard work of people, we do know that as countries continue to industrialize and in some ways are influenced by Western capitalism and the adoption of these intensification systems, that we see an increase as these countries become more affluent, quote unquote, that there's also an increase in meat consumption and animal product consumption in general. So it's pretty bleak, to be honest. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's need to know information for anybody out there who might be considering changing the way that they engage with the systems in the world around us. And, people might think, oh, well, it's only one more day. I might as well have my chicken pad thai. What does it matter if I have it today or if I have it tomorrow or if I don't or if I stop or whatever, so it's a constant like justification almost in a way. And I think that Chris is dealing with that in this song as well. You have a section called The Open Secret, where he writes, "Still I know as well as anyone that it does less good than harm to be this honest with a conscience eased by lies." And I'm wondering if, that's sort of a question to the audience, to the listener. Ask yourself, what lies are you telling yourself to help you sleep at night? Does that make sense? Is that kind of what The Open Secret is about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always say to my students, especially because I know that animal issues are just so emotional for people and people feel a lot of guilt and shame. And I always say it's not personal. The way that these systems have developed is not that people hate animals or that they're looking to harm animals because people are vicious, terrible people. It's because it serves profit, it serves capital. And so I guess one of the things that is important to me is that in talking about the open secret, that we really depersonalize it, that it's about taking essentially a sociological view, a critical sociological view of the rise of animal industrial agriculture, and to think about who profits from that, which corporations are profiting from that, and to think about it on a more systems level. And then in terms of ideology, understanding, well, what are the ideological apparati that support this material use of animals in such a violent way, and really the violent use of other human beings. I spent part of my master's interviewing slaughterhouse workers, primarily because I didn't want to see the demonization of the workers anymore within the animal movement. So I thought that was a real limitation at the time about what I saw in terms of the animal liberation, that there wasn't enough consideration of how workers are also ground up in this terrible machine. And so the open secret is really about a kind of willed ignorance that I think that we're socialized to not engage with animal issues. We're not encouraged to have an understanding of where animal products are coming from. And then in addition to that kind of distancing, or that distanciation, which some people call it, that kind of removal of us from these conditions, we're then bombarded with advertising and various different ideological overlays through religion and just through everyday socialization that show that animals don't matter, or that food animals in particular. There's really specific ways that we demonize, let's say, pigs or chickens or cows as being stupid, or kind of we see this inflection of Cartesian thinking with this kind of idea that they don't know any better, they're just stupid, all these different forms of rationalization. And so even though people kind of have it, I think, a little bit hovering in the background that we know these things are bad, I think that there's a willed way that we're not engaging with those questions because they're pretty uncomfortable, because I think we're all fairly implicated. And, one of the things that really strikes me about the animal question is that, even if you don't really give a shit about animals, certainly if you're interested in issues of racialization and legacies of racism in Canada, and issues around working class history and labor movements, slaughterhouses are a site where there's just still tremendous abuse of workers happening, and a real devastation of people's lives and bodies through these literal meat grinders. So yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of the material way that it's an open secret that we kind of know, but don't want to know. And then there's the way that the ideologies that we're immersed in help us justify that kind of turning away.
Yeah, well, this record came out in '96, but then in 2001, Today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes comes out, and the closing track, Purina Hall of Fame, begins with a sound that I guarantee has haunted almost all Propaganda listeners over the years, and that is the screaming pigs, essentially, that are being murdered. But there's a line in this song that I think a lot of people will be curious about your take on, and it connects to that sound. But back on this record, in this song, Nailing Descartes to the Wall, Chris writes, "But you cannot deny that meat is still murder, dairy is still rape." And then you write about how humans are usually only considered the victims of murder or rape, but how we usually talk about mean things that happen to animals as cruelty. So we sort of gloss over it. But I'm curious about your use of these crimes that we recognize as murder and sexual assault and rape in the use of this song.
So the question is about using some of the language around crime, which we talk about in the chapter in terms of murder or rape, which is a reference to the lyrics.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, what you think about the use of these terms that we would usually associate with crimes against human beings, like murder, rape, and how in this context, Chris is writing about how those things are crimes that are committed against non-human animals. And so, I think that it's something that I've wondered about for a while, and I'm curious about your take on Chris's use of those terms to paint the picture within this song.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I grapple with a lot in my own research and in my teaching as well, that I don't usually use those sorts of terms myself, because sometimes people just can be very reactive. It's not that philosophically, I don't think that they're defensible. I think that talking about animals being murdered, for example, is defensible. But, with a term like rape, I think that as people are entering into thinking about our political and ethical obligations to animals, that using a term like rape is potentially very inflammatory and alienating for some people. But if you look at what actually happens to animals within industrial animal agriculture, so within the animal industrial complex, certainly their bodies are being violated, and their reproductive organs are being violated as a matter of course. It's part of the artificial insemination. It's not done with consent. And so I think that using a term like rape or talking about these crimes like murder is a way of trying to underscore the significance of the violence that's done to non-human animal bodies. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my own work is that when people make those sorts of analogies, is that I try to let the people who have had those experiences to come to the forefront. If somebody's going to draw an analogy or to use a term like that, I typically leave it to the folks who have had those experiences. So there's been all sorts of debates about, using terms like slavery or talking about the Holocaust in relationship to animals. And I think there's a desire, there's some way that people are trying to get people to understand the depth of the pain and the scale of the problem by using our existing markers to name those sorts of processes or experiences. And there's certainly people within various different communities that have lived through the Holocaust or have had various different experiences of violence that talk about their experiences as being entry points into thinking about the question of the animal, that they saw something in their experience reflected in what's happening to animals. And so I guess that's a kind of maybe a wishy-washy answer. I think that we need terms that underscore violence, and that for the most part, those are still in a Western context, human-centered terms, and that a lot of the ways that we justify our harms to animals are using euphemisms. And so I think Chris's attempt to name the harm is important.
Yeah, and then in the next section, there's a section called Touching the Web where Chris actually gets sort of self-reflective, and he's like, I'm still as stupid as anyone, but I know my mistakes. I recognize one form of oppression. Now I recognize the rest. And it seems like he's almost asking people to recognize like, hey, we're all dummies and we're all trying to like sort of figure this out as we go along. And, he's asking us to grow. Does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that has always been important to me about propaganda and about my dedication and commitment to intersectional thought and anti-colonial thought is the idea that you never figure it out. I mean, you're always just in the process, that these political movements have to be understood much more as verbs and less as nouns. There's no place of arrival. And so that kind of desire to understand how oppressions intersect and how one is implicated in one's responsibilities to it make perfect sense to me as a political position, that it's about an ongoing interrogation and critical self-reflection that I think Chris is known for. And part of the reason why people connect with the work of propaganda is that honest, ongoing self-interrogation.
Yeah, and throughout the chapter that you wrote, Chris's words are throughout. And you mentioned earlier that you interviewed him as well. What stands out to you about your interactions with Chris, about asking him about his work over the years as an interviewer yourself for your show and for your research? What was it like chatting with him, and what was that experience? What did that do for you?
Well, it's funny because now I'm conscious of the fact that like propaganda might listen to this. So, those interviews I did with Animal Voices when I was interviewing propaganda were just totally fangirl kind of interviews. I mean,
I love it.
Even though, I've dedicated my career and my activism to hopefully critical thinking of some kind. It's pretty funny because, in relationship to propaganda, they are my starting point and into a political consciousness in many ways. And so Chris, one of the things that I've always appreciated about him and the interview that we did with him is that he is willing to have some vulnerability around discussing his childhood, to think about masculinity. He highlights that in the interview that we did with him for this chapter, where he talked about this experience that he had as a young boy going on a hunting trip, and just how bizarre it seemed to him, in the sense of alienation that he had about the process and what it meant to kill someone else, and how that had anything to do with anything. And so the interviews that I've done with Chris have just always struck me as being him really trying to be as honest as possible about his own origin stories, and then to show himself as somebody who is always growing. And I think that's an invitation for other people as well, like that. The idea of like, I'm going to call you on your ship, but he really means it. Like, he wants people to call him on his, because I think he realizes that to be like a quote unquote good person in the world means that you're always changing, and that you're never arriving in a place of comfortable complacency.
Yes. I've had similar interactions in the whole fangirling sort of thing with Chris. And if anybody listens to our Duplicate Keys interview with Chris, I start off the whole thing talking 100 miles an hour the whole time. But yeah, it's just a real pleasure that they're willing to be so open and honest. I've had similar experiences, and it's really inspiring. So Dr. Corman, it's been 26 years, I think, since you mentioned you first heard propaganda in the mid-90s. And one of the opening lines of your book chapter reads, "Many people consider propaganda to be a life-saving band." And all these years later, I'm wondering if you can tell me about the meaning of propaganda to you now at this point in your life, after having been a fan for so many years.
I went back and I read the chapter, and I think we said it was many people consider them a life-changing band, but I really like that you said saving, actually, because
Maybe I misread it. I probably misquoted you. I'm sorry.
no, that's actually, I thought it was really insightful. I thought, in some ways, like maybe as we both are such huge fans, like, I mean, for me, it wrested me out of some of the real limitations of rural Manitoba, and propaganda was absolutely integral to my development as a human being and my own ability to name my experiences, and the kind of experiences that I saw around me, and the kind of violence that I was really desperate to try to name and to understand. And so I think that life-changing, life-saving, I think they're probably equal when people think about propaganda and the significance of them to their own personal development.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Corman, where can people find you and your work if they want to follow along with what you're doing and, follow your work?
I should say, I mean, there's Kiki is in the background. This is one of the cats that I'm living with now. I've
Wonderful.
recently moved in. So if people heard someone crying in the background, it's, I think, because Kiki is missing her primary guardian.
Kiki.
So if you're like, we interviewed Dr. Corman and there was like some animal
screaming
being
baby
tortured in the bed. I fed them before the interview in the hopes that maybe Kiki would not be as upset, but so people can find me on Instagram under Fugazitarian, which is funny because, an homage to a band, Fugazi has obviously played an important role in my intellectual and activist trajectories as well. But for social media stuff, I'm still not sure about my relationship with Twitter, but I do have a Twitter handle. It's just Lauren Corman. We offer classes through Brock University as well. People are interested in the critical animal studies program there. I'm a sociology professor, and sometimes people think I'm a critical animal studies professor insofar as that we have a department. We don't. It's just interesting that Brock has this cluster of courses together that make this bank called critical animal studies. And so if you're interested in, learning more about critical animal studies, I can answer any questions. Or if you're interested in taking some of those classes, they're available at Brock University as well. So I'm not sure what else. People can write me. I'm always happy to hear from people. You can write me my institutional address. It's easy to find me online at lcorman@brocku.ca, or you can write me at laurencorman@gmail.com. I almost said at animalvoices@gmail.com, but that's my old days of radio. So
fabulous. Well, Dr. Lauren Corman, thank you so much for coming on Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda, and I've learned so much, and I have a lot of unpacking to do about our conversation whenever we finish up.
Thanks. I guess I just wanted to underscore again that none of this is personal. It's always something that, I usually in my classes, I have 12 weeks to do, where I can try to assure people that, the conversation about animal issues is not trying to say anybody's a bad person. It's trying to bring animal issues, which I think propaganda has done for so long, into a sociological analysis that thinks about our treatment of animals in terms of white Westerners, their treatment of animals as coming out of these really bad legacies, in which there's some opportunity, I think, for us to make some changes at that structural and institutional and systemic level that is not about any individual person being a bad person. That's something I always want to let people know and kind of leave them with. I guess I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really a super fun chance to talk about this band that's been so important to me. And I really love that you're doing this show, and I've really enjoyed listening to many of your episodes. So thanks a lot.
You cannot deny that.
I absolutely love that interview, and I can't believe that we have another. Our second guest is Ray Harkins from the 100 Words or Less podcast, which is one of my all-time favorite podcasts. And Ray is also the vocalist for hardcore legends Taken. I actually overlooked Ray's music back in the day and found him because of his incredible 400 plus episode podcast with the most incredible back catalog of interviews out there. Ray is like the podcasting master, and he's also an advocate for music across the board. And I've been listening to his show 100 Words or Less for years at this point. So it was completely fantastic to get his take on Propaganda, being a fan of the band, and nailing Descartes to the wall. So please enjoy my conversation with Ray Harkins from the 100 Words or Less podcast. Ray Harkins, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
This is a absolute privilege and a pleasure to be welcomed onto this, fine format of the podcast, talking about why this band is the most important band of all time.
Yes. Okay. Well, Ray, what's really funny is the reason I reached out to you is because I follow you on Twitter, and you posted a tweet several weeks back that said, "What is your favorite band and why isn't it Propaganda?" And what's so funny is, like, I have listened to your podcast, 100 Words or Less, for a long time. For at least 5 years now, I've listened to probably not every episode, but like every third or fourth episode for sure, based on my own personal preference with the guests that you have on. But like, man, your guest list is so amazing. Like, I've listened, some of my favorites off the top of my head are Russ Rankin. I think I heard George Pettit, John Dyer Baisley. I'm wearing a Baroness shirt, like literally right now. Nathan Gray for sure was a huge one. Norman Brannon. But then you also had Chris Hanna and John K. Sampson. So you have just got this fantastic array of guests across your 100 Words or Less podcast. So as a podcaster whom I personally enjoy your work, podcaster to podcaster, what do you love about podcasting in general?
Well, thank you for the compliments. It definitely, it is weird when you're in the middle of something and then you take a step back and you look at the project of whatever it is you're working on, and then kind of like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, just wow, I'm like 400 episodes into this thing, and like, I've been able to speak to people's art I've respected, since I was a teenager. And so, yeah, it is wild to do that. And then to be able to, not only selfishly have these conversations, but then to selflessly share them with other people. It's so cool. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the medium is so powerful because it is being able to document something in long form in the own person's voice, to be able to get all of the nuances that exist with their, speech patterns, the way they talk, and frankly, just like an audio version of a zine. Because I really do feel like all of these things that are being put together, by people like yourself and me and many of our other peers and friends, is this document of a scene or a band or whatever it is that they're focused on. Because I think that is what is so incredibly important to me is being able to set up context for why these people are important, why their art's important or whatever. Because I think a lot of times it's really easy to, look at something and kind of say like, oh yeah, like I understand that. But, a lot of the times, if you haven't either lived through it or had some sort of touch point beyond just listening to a song, you're not going to have that context for it. Like, I use the example of, it's like drive-through records, where it's like, you say that and, most people now are just like, oh yeah, like I've heard of the record label or whatever. But it's like, that is like, you could not be a larger record label in the independent music scene in the late 90s and 2000s.
Yep, exactly.
And it's impossible to kind of describe that to people unless you're being able to, speak to the bands and, I mean, the people who ran the label don't necessarily want to talk about it, but just being able to kind of paint that holistic picture. And I think that's what you're able to do with podcasts in a real way that, other mediums, can accomplish it to a certain extent, whether it's like an oral history or, something in the written word. But to hear it straight from a person's mouth is, I think, just why the medium is so beautiful.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. Like, I'm thinking about it as like an audio zine now as well. Like I used to listen to Maximum Rock and Roll, get like Punk Planet and stuff like that. And but now, like, I can take my quote unquote zines with me while I go for like a 5 or 10 mile run. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have to be sitting motionless. I can be using my body, like getting healthy, staying physically fit, but also consuming the ideas and the thoughts and the words of the people who I want to listen to. And so I'm right on board there with you. And it's such a powerful medium in that regard, that it's so perfectly niche as well. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can find a specific target audience, propaganda super fans. Boom, that's my audience. Does that make sense?
Oh, completely. I mean, whatever it is you are interested in, there is someone speaking about it, pontificating about it, maybe not as good as they should be doing, but that's that's part of
Yeah.
the learning curve of doing a podcast at large. But yeah, completely, it is able to focus on the things that are a subculture, and then are also a subculture of a subculture, or a specific thing about this specific subculture. And it gives you the space in which to explore this thing in a real in-depth way that, it's not going to be, This American Life or, Serial
Mhm.
or any of these other large shows, but that's not the point. This,
Yeah.
what you are doing and what I am doing is not, we're not trying to be everything to everybody. We're trying to be something to the people who should be listening to this thing,
Yeah. Man, and I think about it like documenting history as well. Like, we recently had Joe and Rob from the Canadian metal band Sacrifice on the show, and like they're and for an hour just talking about the history of Southern Ontario thrash metal. It's so wild to have those conversations documented for everybody now who wants to hear it, and it just feels like a tiny little sliver of history that we're capturing.
Oh, completely. And I think that's so, with the digital age that we live in, and having all of these, music scenes being able to be documented is so incredibly important, because that, putting my whatever rose-colored glasses, old man sitting on the porch sort of scenario. I loved when I started to figure out all of these different music scenes, whether it
Yeah.
was like Louisville or, like you mentioned, Southern Ontario. It's like, being from Southern California, nothing could be, farther removed from me than like,
Mm.
the hardcore and punk scene from Southern Ontario. But getting obsessed with bands like, Chokehold, Grade, Left 4 Dead, like all of the stuff that came out
Oh
of
my
there.
God, brilliant stuff.
Yeah, and it just being like, wait a minute, like, why? First of all, why is all this stuff coming out of this particular area?
Yeah.
But then, like you said, being able to kind of, get this person's experience documented to where it can, paint a broader picture of why this thing was happening the way that it did, or whatever, from the person that was actually creating that art or creating that scene.
Oh my God. And Damian Abraham's podcast, Turned Out a Punk, documents those specific stories so well. I love that one as well. Do you have any other favorite like podcasts, like music related, that you personally consume, like as to, inspire you within your own show?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm really, really good friends with Matt Carter, who does a
Oh my
podcast.
God. His is so good. Emery.
Yeah, and he does the Labeled podcast, which is
Yeah.
basically a deep dive into the Tooth and Nail Records history. I think what he does is really, really incredible. I mean, that record label and that scene was, really instrumental to me. So being able to hear those people's stories who I knew a lot of the broad strokes of it, but then
Mhm.
being able to hear the inspiration behind a lot of these things, and getting deep dives into like it's like I don't care about a band like 90 Pound Wuss at all.
Yeah.
Like I didn't identify with them, but hearing their story on a recent episode, I was kind of like, oh, cool. Like I see where they're coming from. And now I'm able to kind of put them in their appropriate place, even though I did not gravitate towards their music. And I think to me, that's what, maybe this is part of like being an adult is, understanding that even though something is not for you, especially from a musical perspective, that you can still respect it and understand it enough. And frankly, that's some of the most valuable feedback that like I personally get for the show that I do, because, I interview a wide variety of bands, as long as it exists within the independent music scene. Sometimes it's like, pop punk, sometimes it's hardcore, whatever. But a person that is able to listen to an episode from a guest that they're like, oh man, I don't like this band at all, but then being able to be like, hey, you know what, like that person was pretty cool, and like I still don't like their band, but now I
Yeah.
understand where they're coming from in a much more holistic sense, and then in turn they're able to place that band in context for the stuff that they do like, and then see that like, okay, well, maybe, whatever the saying of, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's like, maybe I just won't write this band off completely because now I
Yeah.
understand where they're coming from.
Amazing. Okay, so let's dive in here for the specific niche of this particular podcast, Propagandy. Ray, how did you first find Propagandy? When was this? What did you first hear?
Yeah, for sure. It's Fat Music for Fat People was my exposure to it. So the, legendary Fat Records compilation that I still think they do different iterations of it now. Do you know? Because I want to say that they put one out like maybe a couple years ago, but
Yeah, well, you mean the Fat Comps?
right, yeah. Like, Fat Music for Fat People was like kind of the first iteration of it.
Yeah.
But I know they still do. I know they still do comps and digital comps and stuff like that. But
Yeah, and I think they do comps for like the music festivals, like Brack Rock or something. I think there's a specific Fat Comp that they do whenever they do those big European punk festivals too.
yeah, for sure. You're right. So that was my first exposure because, so I'm, 39 years old. So basically the early 90s was kind of, when punk, the year that punk broke, from Green Day and Rancid and Offspring and all that stuff happening, and being from Southern California, that stuff was pretty inescapable. And so I was desiring anything from Epitaph, Fat Records, like all that stuff was really, really important to me. And so the Fat Music for Fat People was a, really important compilation for me, just because, it gave a great cross section of all of these bands that I loved. And I was like, I didn't know I loved them at the time because I just got the, $5 compilation CD, and was like, all right, let's see what's happening. Like, do I like Tilt or do I like Lagwagon? Like, just being able to balance that. But Anti-Manifesto was the first song on a comp, which is that is a deliberate decision from Fat Records
For sure.
like, and I loved that they put that song first. So I just, at that point I was like, oh, okay, like this band is great, I'm going to buy How to Clean Everything. And I remember I bought that at a of course now defunct record store called CD Listening Bar, which was this concept. It was so hilarious to me. Like I loved it, but it was basically, so it's just a normal kind of like CD store, but their concept is that you could open the CD, like hand it to an employee, and that you would be able to listen to the entire CD, like just sitting there. And it was unbelievable because I just punished the clerk. I would just bring up 10 CDs and be like, all right, I want to listen to all these things.
Yeah.
And so I would just sit in there for hours and buy like one CD, but it was an incredibly informative experience. But that's where I bought How to Clean Everything. And at that point, whatever, I was 14, 15 years old. And there was a lot of things going on in my life in regards to broadening my perspective of, being a, white boy from the suburbs that, from an upper middle class family, and just understanding that like not everybody's experience was like my experience. Bands like Rage Against the Machine kind of paved the way for me to understand that like, oh, like there are different people's plights and different cultures and all of these other things that I just hadn't been exposed to on a regular basis. And so Propagandy was really, really foundational for me on that. And so, yeah, that was how I discovered Propagandy. And I didn't, I presume we'll talk about seeing them live later.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't get a chance to see them until it was like the early 2000s because they obviously don't tour very much. But I remember, I think it was shortly after I got How to Clean Everything, or not shortly after, but, in that general vicinity, where I didn't have the autonomy to go to a lot of shows on my own. But I remember they played a bank in Southern California with
Holy
Final
smokes.
Conflict. Yeah, it was a really, I don't think they had shows there ever again, but like, it was like them and Final Conflict and a bunch of other bands. But like I got the flyer, much late, like a year later after the show, just like, oh wow, this show happened. And I'm like, damn, I did not know about that because, I didn't get the flyer or whatever. So,
oh man.
Like, yeah.
Well, and what's so crazy about that is Chris Hanna wears that Final Conflict t-shirt on stage constantly.
Totally. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And that was, and I've became friends with the singer of Final Conflict, Ron Martinez, and I remember asking him about that show because it was so weird because it was like, I think it was in the Los Angeles area, or I don't know, but it was one of those things where it was just like, why was it at a bank? Like, the bank was not functional anymore, but like it was clearly still a building that had been used as a bank. And so I
Yeah.
don't know, just like someone found it and they did one show there. And I just remember him saying it was a pretty sketchy show. And like the amount of people that showed up there that were, kind of antagonistic towards Propaganda was, it was palpable. And the show was definitely a little more on the sketchy side of things. So, in retrospect, I'm probably glad I didn't go to that because, at 14 or 15 years old, I would probably be scared for myself. But,
Oh my gosh, that is such a cool story. I'm so glad you told me that. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I worked in a CD store that had that exact same concept of opening literally anything you wanted out of the factory shrink wrap and letting you listen to the entire thing at listening bars. It was called Street Side Records on Watson Road in St. Louis, Missouri. And I worked there for, several years during high school and early in college. And I know exactly, I can picture the people's faces who would do exactly what you just said. You know what I mean? They would come up with like 5 or 6 things and I would rip it open. And then the ones that they didn't buy, we had a shrink wrap machine behind the counter where we had to go back there, put it inside the plastic wrap. And then we had the hot blow dryer that would re-shrink wrap the albums. And then we put them back up on the shelves like they were never even opened in the first place. And it's hilarious thinking about people spending $17.99 on a CD that wasn't even in the original factory shrink wrap.
Yeah. Oh, dude, for sure. Yeah, it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And the days of that shrink wrap gun, because I used to work. My first job was at Blockbuster Video, and we for sure did that with VHS tapes as well.
Nice.
And just that feeling of the blow drying gun and the shrink wrap. Like it's still to this day one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so on your show, 100 Words or Less, you've had both John K. Sampson and Chris Hanna on your podcast. What stands out to you about your interaction with those two fellows?
So Chris Hanna was definitely, I knew I always wanted to speak to somebody in Propaganda. I mean, Chris was kind of the most logical person because he's the most public, and the podcast that he was doing with his fellow G7 co-conspirator.
Oh yeah.
Escape
Velocity, great show.
Yeah. And so I was like, okay, well, he knows what the concept of a podcast is. So like, I'll feel okay reaching out to him. And I can't remember. I want to say that I think that they were Propaganda as a Twitter account was already following me as a person. So I was able to, DM them. And I want to say that that's how Chris and I got in touch. And he was totally accommodating, just like the sweetest dude in regards to like, yes, like I would love to, be on the show. And there was no misgivings about, how far back you wanted to go. And it was just a great experience. And like, I was nervous, but at the same time, I didn't, I don't know. I was much, much more nervous in speaking to John K. Sampson because I had to jump through a lot of hoops for that one, which I'll address in a moment. But but Chris was just, an incredible chat, an incredible interview. You've obviously spoken to him, and he's just, it's interesting because it's like he's, the humor in his band is obviously comes directly from him, and the sort of self-deprecating nature of just like, oh, I'm just a stupid guy that likes hockey. Like, like it just comes out as a person, and you see why the band exists in that space. And so it was very interesting to talk to him as a person and kind of be like, oh, I see why your band is exactly like this. This is you. So that was really cool. And then, having John K. Sampson, that was literally I want to say I approached him for probably about 2 years. And he's notoriously, interview shy. Like I know that on one of the record cycles for, I can't remember if it was a Weaker Thans record or one of his solo records, but basically he only did interviews via postcard.
Yeah.
And I was so intimidated by that. And like, I never got the sense that it was him being like a dick. It was just him being like, I don't like this. Like, I don't want to participate in this. And so I was like, okay, well, I get that. And, I try to go through all the sort of traditional channels. I, have friends that are not only friends with him, but then friends that work at, Epitaph or whatever. So I was like, okay, try the official channels. Nothing ever happened. And then finally, my wife actually brought up the idea where she's like, well, why don't you just, have Chris from Propaganda introduce, like, be able to bridge that gap. And I was like, well, I guess that's a good idea. I guess I'll try that. And of course, Chris was like, oh yeah, like I think he would be into the idea. And so then he connected me to John. and then emailed back and forth with John for a moment. And it was one of those things where like his house was going through renovations, and so he was like, I want to be able to do this on a a dedicated landline.
Yeah.
And so he's like, can you write me in 6 months? And I was just like, oh, sure. And almost to the day, I was like, hey, John, just follow it up. And then we were able to set it up. And I remember, getting on good old Skype machine and, calling him up. And then what struck me was how nervous he was. Like I immediately was kind of not disarmed, but just kind of like, oh, wow. Like he's nervous about this because he obviously doesn't do interviews like this and the sort of long form content that a podcast is. He just doesn't do that. And so after a good, 10 or 15 minutes, he settled in and, I felt like he was more at ease, but I just was, I was like, oh wait, dude, no, I'm nervous. You shouldn't be nervous. You're fine, dude. We're just hanging out, man.
Yeah. Exactly. I love when you can establish that vibe of just hanging out, and that's all it is. It's just such a satisfying feeling to, just be on the human level with the artists that you admire and just ask them questions about their lives. Like that's all it's about to me,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, that I felt very, he was, John K. Sampson was like the total white whale for me.
Sure.
And like once I accomplished that, I was like, all right, cool, man. Well, whatever else happens after this, and that was, some 200 episodes ago. I was like, whatever I get after this is like, it's all gravy from here.
Well, and what's so crazy is Keith and I landed one of our white whale guests, John Darnielle from the Mountain Goats, on like within the first 10 episodes. Like it was absolutely crazy that we were able to get that. So I know that feeling so well. And you're just like, man, life is just awesome sometimes.
Yeah, no, for sure. Especially when the idea of the execution of the thing where you're just like, that would be cool if this happened. And then once it happens, you're just kind of like, huh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That happened.
I love it. Okay. So let's dive into some other stories. Have you ever seen, you mentioned earlier you saw Propaganda live. When was that? What stands out to you at the live experiences, et cetera? I'm just curious about your experiences of seeing them live and what that was like for you.
Absolutely. So yeah, I saw them on the Today's Empires Tomorrow's Ashes tour. I
Lucky.
want to say, yeah. So it was
God,
early. It was
so
early.
lucky.
It was early 2000s. I want to say it was either 2000 or 2001. And it was them and Avail, and it was at a place. They don't do shows in Los Angeles at this place anymore, but it was a place called the Palace. And I want to say like a 1,500 cap room or something, so relatively large. And
wow, that's huge.
Yeah, and they completely sold it out. Or at least that's my memory of it. I can't recall if they actually did. But so, by this time I had already loved Propaganda for, many years after I got into them in 94, 95. And so it was kind of this weird, like pent up, demand that I had for just being like, okay, like whatever I'm going to experience, this is going to be great because I love pretty much their entire catalog up to that point. And so, watching them play, it was really interesting because, by that time, John was out of the band. And so they were this new kind of, touring unit. And I don't know, I wasn't disappointed with them by any stretch of the imagination. And seeing these songs live that had been in my head for so long was really, a cathartic experience. But it was interesting because by that time, too, they're older dudes. Like they weren't, these whatever 19-year-olds that are jumping around on stage or whatever. And by that time, their technical prowess is what they were really leaning into. Like they were just like, we're not a dumb punk band. Like, we're a, thrash metal meets punkish, like, the version that they are now.
Yeah.
And so they're playing, like they were stationary, they weren't this like highly energetic band, where in my head, that was a lot of what I was used to in watching bands play, especially the idea of a lead singer independent from a musical instrument, And so it was really interesting because it was one of those things where I was in awe, but at the same time, I was kind of like, oh, okay, like this is, a different experience than maybe what I was like originally anticipating. So, and I know because they make themselves so scarce from a touring perspective, that's what that pent up demand of why that show was, or why that tour did so well for them and why the show in Los Angeles was so successful. But I remember being like, oh, okay, like that was different than what I had envisioned, but it was still unbelievable to see these songs and to watch them live. And I think so. I've seen them, I think, 4 times. So I saw them at the Fest once. I saw them. I actually played a show with them.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Has Taken been involved in any shows with them at all?
So Taken never got to play with them. I played in a band after Taken called Makoto, and we were around from like 2004 to about 2008 or 9 or something.
Okay.
And they had come through and played the Glass House in Pomona, another Southern California venue. And this was probably 2006, 2007. They were on tour with Lumeria and a band called Bridge and Tunnel, I want to say. But fortunately, I just knew the show promoter. And I was like, listen, we don't make any sense on this show whatsoever. Like, we're going to bum people out, but I need to play with Propaganda.
Yeah.
And I was like, I basically forced ourselves to play, like, be the 4 out of whatever, the 1 out of 4 on the show. And it was awesome. I mean, people were kind. Like, we definitely, we were kind of a melodic metalcore thing going on. So again, did not fit in that show at all from a sonic perspective. But I was able to get up on stage and pontificate for a few moments about why Propaganda is so important and why we're playing this show.
Awesome.
And then meeting Chris in person there, was really cool. And but yeah, that was definitely just a completely selfish move of being like, I just gotta play with Propaganda, man. I don't think this will ever happen again. So
I tell you what, I was talking to Ben Murray from Heart Sounds and Light This City, and he had exactly the same response, where they had the opportunity on Heart Sounds' last tour to go play with Propaganda 4 shows on the East Coast, and Ben was like, I will do literally anything to make those shows happen. And so I know that experience, because you're not the first person who said that.
Oh, absolutely. It's just like, there are certain things that you just like want to will in existence. And it's just like, well, I don't care. Like, I'll get up there with an acoustic guitar, even though I don't really know how to play acoustic guitar, and I would just be yelling. But it's like, dude, whatever. Like, I just want to share the stage with this band that, has provided so much enjoyment from a musical perspective, but all of these building blocks for who I am and what I believe philosophically. It's just like, I had to do that.
Well, shout out really quick to Lemuria, who is a Buffalo, New York band. So they live down the road from where I am here in Buffalo. So woohoo. So real quick, you just mentioned philosophical stuff. How have Propaganda inspired your personal belief systems about the world? I know that's a big question, but how did they change your way of seeing life itself?
Absolutely. Like I mentioned, this sort of inextricable link that I was able to place between a band like Rage Against the Machine, in the early 90s, and understanding that not everybody's experiences were the same as mine. And then being able to draw a straight line to a band like Propaganda and see like, okay, like, this band is clearly not as big as Rage Against the Machine. And I understand that this sort of, because when you're a kid and you're just identifying with music, you're listening to it devoid of context. You're not listening to it because it's part of a scene or whatever. Like, yes, you are, in the sense of like, okay, this is, a punk band or whatever, but like, you're listening to music for music's sake, really just visceral reactions. Like, this is good, this is bad. And, that's it. And so understanding that Propaganda was, part of the same sort of tree that a band like Rage Against the Machine was, from the sort of like, really, really politically active and, very divisive to a lot of people, trying to push buttons, trying to make sure that you are considering your existence in a, real way, whether that's your interaction with other people or your interaction with the outside world and, corporate structures and all this stuff. So, Propaganda was basically being able to feed all into that, but being able to speak to it in a, real way that connected all of these, somewhat disparate issues in my head, where it's like, I look at it like, Rage Against the Machine was kind of, painting with a very broad brush, and, understanding these general concepts was really important. But then Propaganda was like, oh, here, we can take this like 7 steps deeper, give you a reading list, being able to integrate some of these, really, really revolutionary political thinkers into our songs, being able to weave them into the lyrics, and then being able to kind of push you off in your own direction to see which ideas you identify with. And so, propaganda, completely pushed me forward in regards to, veganism and vegetarianism. Like I went vegetarian when I was 16 years old, and, I've been vegan and vegetarian ever since then. And understanding the concept of, sexuality and your position as a man was like completely blew my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it just understanding where it was like, oh wow, like there is a certain privilege that comes with being a man. There's a certain privilege that comes with being white. And like all of this stuff was ping-ponging in my head as I was consuming so much of the stuff that they were suggesting for, further research, whether it was, Noam Chomsky, anything that they were producing from that perspective, AK Press, all of this stuff was so just like, oh, okay, like I gotta check this out in order to understand this better. And like, do I understand the geopolitical concerns of, Chevron? Like, no, I'm 16 years old. I barely can tie my shoe.
Yeah.
But then seeing how all of that was, inspiring me in other ways where it's just like, oh, I was already into George Orwell. I was already doing, reports my freshman year on, 1984, and then being able to see the connective tissues that this, author had with this punk band from the middle of Canada. I was like, my gosh, this is all connected.
Yeah.
So, to say that, propaganda was a massive influence on me in regards to understanding my position in the world would be a complete understatement. And that's why, still to this day, they are, such an important band, not only musically, but philosophically. And so it just, a profound influence.
Well, speaking of philosophy, so, there's the person Rene Descartes, who asserted once that animals are merely organic automata. In propaganda, critiques this. Descartes also said that a cat nailed to a wall and disemboweled would scream, but only as an unthinking response, not a real expression of pain as a human would experience it. So when I reached out to you to talk about a particular song, you chose the 1 minute and 4 second long Nailing Descartes to the Wall from Less Talk, More Rock. Why did you choose this particular song and episode to appear on with me?
Absolutely. No, I appreciate you putting that in context, because I think it was what's always, I mean, this record to me is like flawless is an understatement. It's like, the Molotov cocktail mixed with, the most unbelievable recording. Cause like you can listen to this and you're just like, this could come out tomorrow and no one would bat an eye.
Yeah.
Like, and not only, from a musical sonic perspective, but then from a philosophical, pondering your place in the world, why you should consider these philosophical beliefs, and just like, being able to put this forward in a real, visceral way where it's like, yes, of course, they were pushing buttons and they were trying to be like, hey, dum-dum, you need to consider this, and you need to look at this way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But so the record to me is flawless. And so I was like, I have to, look at the songs here and kind of be like, all right, which thing is important to me here? And I just remember when I first got this record and, listening through it, and the seamless transition between, the first and second song of, consider someone else, stop consuming animals, where it was just like, I was already there. Like, I already had sort of teetered on the edge, between, a band like Earth Crisis and a band like Propaganda, which
Mm-hmm.
like is just hilarious because both of those bands, like, would theoretically hate one another.
Yeah.
Like, but it made sense in my head. And so being able to, really put in clear terms why it is that I feel that, eating animals is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And listening to this song and just understanding, like, and the way that I always really appreciated what it was that they put out was that, like, hey, this is what we believe and this is why we believe it. But we're stupid. We're humans. We have no idea what we're doing, but this is what we believe.
Mm.
And that sort of, and not even from like a, sort of tongue in cheek, like perspective that they, had more presently on how to clean everything. This one was definitely like, there obviously was a self-deprecating aspect to, you know, everything that they were doing. But I think this record was really kind of trying to thread that needle of like, listen, we're still dumb humans, and you know, you don't have to believe what we believe, but this is why we strongly believe what we believe.
Right. Well, I mean, that line, and I'm still as stupid as anyone, but I know my mistakes. It's almost like I know for a fact that I will never be perfect. I'll never do all the good things that I want to do within the short confines of a single lifetime. But this is one thing that I know that I can be successful at right off the bat. And even though I'm a total dummy, and actually, like, you know, you may feel like this as well, but the more things that I read in the world, the dumber I almost feel. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. You feel in the same way that it's exciting to, you know, find out about a different genre of music, and like you know, you lift up that rock, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, like there's this whole other thing here that I never even sort of considered. I completely agree. It's the same way where, as you start to pick away these different layers of philosophy, you're just like, oh yeah, I'm continually swimming upstream, and I will always be, you know, brought back to that place of being like, I don't know anything. Like I am trying, like, and I think that was what was, you know, you bringing that up, it really triggers a response in me where it was like, you know, I've always self-identified as, you know, Christian. I've always been religious, and that was something that I've chosen for myself, even though like I was raised a certain way. I definitely got down to the path of like, do I believe this? And like ultimately I did. And being able to listen to a band like Propaganda, who is clearly anti-religious, like, you know, clearly, like I do not agree with them on that perspective. I believe that religion in itself is bad, but the actual, you know, anchoring of a person to something spiritual is not bad. But being able to listen to them and be like, oh yeah, like I don't necessarily agree with you on that, but I agree with you on all of these other things. And again, not being like, oh, this philosophical belief is invalid because I don't align with you on these other things. And it was just so like, it made me feel so at peace to be like, yes, like this is still incredibly important to me. And I think all of these things that I was able to bring in personally from, you know, bands like Propaganda and you know, whatever, Straight Edge and all of these other things that sometimes were in direct opposition to the philosophical underpinnings of the religion that I was following. It was so like, I'll never forget being this, you know, whatever weirdo punk kid in my like Lutheran high school, and, you know, like Xing up as I'm going to high school, like, you know, and then being like, oh yeah, I don't eat meat. And they were just kind of like, what the hell is this kid? And like, wait, you're also Christian? Like, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And then, but then being like, well, yes, like I really believe these things are all connected. And then, you know, having this, like, you know, these two, you know, what may seem at odds from one another, being able to, in my mind, being able to add up to the 2 + 2 = 4, where I'm just like, yes, like I see how these things are all connected. But then to another person is like, what the hell are you talking about, dude?
Yeah.
I don't see where you're arriving at this, but yeah, I completely see what you're talking about as far as like I just don't know anything.
Do any of the other specific lines of the song jump out at you lyrically?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I just think the visceral nature of this song, like being a minute-long song, you pack in so much in such a short period of time, not only musically, but lyrically, and just understanding that it's like, we cannot waste any time here. You know, we are going, every word is so deliberate. And I think to me, that was just like, you know, but you cannot deny that meat is still murder and dairy is still rape. Like, I remember hearing that dairy is still rape, and I'm just like, what the hell is he talking about?
100%.
Like,
Same with me.
And like, just trying to grapple with that idea, I was like, okay, I understand the meat is still murder. Like, that was already sort of not hard boiled in me, because like I was not raised vegetarian and I didn't have that in my head. But then being able to understand that these two things played into one another, because, you know, the common conception, if you are, you know, a vegetarian, is like, oh yeah, like, you know, these animals are being saved because I'm not eating them. But it's like, well, there's also this really other horrific side of the dairy industry that you are not paying attention to in any respect, and you probably should. And so I think being able to kind of like just really cut through the BS and just line it up and be like, here you go. Like, this is something you need to consider. And there's no other pure way of saying it than that. Like I remember too, where it was I think I want to say it was in like, because of course going to like a Lutheran high school, we had like theology class. And I definitely remember at certain points, you as a student were responsible for like leading a daily devotion or something like that. And I remember there were times in which like I was absolutely considering like playing a song, like this song in particular, to the class to kind of be like, hey, I'm just trying to make this connection between, religion and vegetarianism and veganism and all this stuff. But then ultimately I was just like, no, this would like, get me thrown out of the classroom.
Wow.
just based on that line alone. And so like I chose these other, like I definitely remember playing, I want to say it was a Boy Sets Fire song, like, Silence Kills the Revolution. I want to say it's like the first song off The Day the Sun Went Out. But just again, going back to the visceral nature of those lines and just being like, oh, yeah, I have to consider this. Like, there's no other way around it.
Did this album or these vegetarian songs in particular on Let's Talk More Rock lead you into any other resources? Like I think about like how this album led me to find the film Earthlings and how it led me to find like Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. Like did this lead you down a path of exploration of other resources?
Absolutely. It's funny. Earthlings I didn't grapple with until, frankly, I started working for PETA, the animal rights organization. That's actually part of the sort of onboarding when you first get hired, is you actually have to watch that documentary, which is like, that's a lot for people.
Yes.
Especially like, I mean, most people that are gravitating towards PETA in the first place clearly already believe the thing, but then being able or having to grapple with that 4-hour-long documentary of some of like the most horrific things that you'll ever see was a lot. But so no, I didn't. That was something that I didn't get connected to, but for sure, like the whole. The whole AK press, and then like just really really diving into all of the political underpinnings of so many of these other record labels and scenes, whether it was like Crime Think coming out of Atlanta, or like Ebullition Records, which was essentially in my backyard here in Southern California, and just understanding the connective tissue between all of these bands that was not apparent for me before, but then seeing that it's like, okay, there's a distinct difference between a band like NoFX and a band like Propagandhi. Even though NoFX obviously does have political underpinnings and you can tell what they believe, but like, I always remember it's like, their cover of Straight Edge. And like, I was like, I love NoFX, but then I felt like targeted because I was like, I'm Straight Edge. And I was like, I understand the whole name of your band is like No Fucking Straight Edge or whatever. Like, I get that. But I always felt that, bands that took those additional steps to be kind of like, here are these additional resources. Here is where we have found, I mean, Noam Chomsky was for sure one. And then I know Diet for a New America by John Robbins, that was for sure influenced by Propagandhi in regards to being like, hey, here's some additional resources. And so while I don't think Propagandhi was kind of like the sort of tip of the iceberg for me, it definitely was like, hey, this is a continued education process. And, this will kind of put you down another path in regards to how you are relating to the world and the world around you. And I just like the bands that did that, provided this sort of like reading list and resources were always so much more engaging to me. Like when these bands felt comfortable enough, like this is a super random aside, but like there was a band from Ottawa, Ontario called Buried Inside. And they put out a couple records on Relapse, but they were this band that they put out a record called Chronology or Chronopolis. I can't remember the exact title, but basically they were deconstructing the idea of time. And they were a very politically active band, like not unlike Propagandhi. They were definitely, vegan dudes. Some of them were straight edge, and like just the idea of being like, oh, here's the concept of time. And this was invented, back in, Egyptian times. And like, it doesn't really hold any relevance because it's not connected. It's just connected to, sunrise and sunset, and time is all relative. Like it just exploded my mind where I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't even consider this. I was just living my life, like looking at minutes and hours and all this stuff. And I felt very much connected to that band in the same way that I felt connected to Propagandhi, because they were just like, it wasn't like they were citing their sources in a really, like bland footnote kind of way. It was like, here are these additional things that have influenced why this record exists and why this song exists.
Well, Ray, we're getting to nearly an hour. Oh my gosh, this has been amazing. If somebody were to come to you and say, "Hey, I kind of missed the boat on Propagandhi," how would you facilitate their listening experience so that maybe they would come to feel as strongly about them as you? Like the people who say, like you said, what is your favorite band and why isn't it Propagandhi? If people were like, who? What would you do then? What would be your path of diving in?
Yeah. Well, for one, I always find it helpful to understand where that person is coming from. Because, I think, most people have a very strong dividing line with Propagandhi. Like there are people like you and I who, sort of worship at their altar and pretty much like whatever they're putting out, like, Chris could fart into a microphone for an hour and I'd probably be like, look, that's pretty good, dude. Pretty good.
Yeah, pretty good, man.
Yeah. I like what you've done there. But like there are people who, basically after, today's Empires, tomorrow's Ashes are kind of like, hey, I'm out. Cause that's when that's when they got more shreddy and more metally and I just wasn't into it. So for one, finding out where the person is coming from, because like, I feel like, for a band like this, the sort of path of least resistance could, prove to be the most beneficial for that listener. So it's like, if they're more coming at it from like, I want to understand the sort of scope of the band, then it's kind of like, all right, well then maybe starting off with today's Empires, tomorrow's Ashes in regards to the sort of like, the connective tissue between, old Propagandhi and quote unquote new Propagandhi, even though, they've been doing that for close to 20 years now. I feel weird saying new, but then if it's a person that's kind of like, oh, I'm more of a, focused on this sort of, punk side of things, then, I would show them the earlier side, of their catalog. So for me, finding out where the person's coming from and then, kind of being able to point them in the right directions, but then ultimately show them the importance of their message. Because I think that would cut through, regardless of their musical underpinnings, whatever their personal preference is, understanding why this band is important on that terminology would be able to help inform the person's love for the music, either old, new, or everything in between. So to me, that would be kind of the best inflection point for a person, and then being able to kind of guide them from there. Because, if you just throw like a random playlist together of Propagandhi, people might just be like, wait, why is this so like disparate? Like, I don't, this one's really aggressive. This one's really like more melodic. I don't understand. And then who the hell is this other guy singing? Like, I just don't, it would be hard because the band has existed for so long. So, it's not a simple answer, but finding where the person's coming from first and then being able to kind of like usher them along.
A random question springs to mind. As you're a longtime fan and so am I. Do you think that Victory Lap is their like punkest sounding record since Let's Talk More Rock?
It probably is. Yeah, that's a good observation. I definitely think that was probably, I found myself listening to that more than like, Supporting Cast or Cast. And I definitely felt that there were elements of like what it was that they were, at the very beginning was sort of, incorporated in there. But it's still just leaned into the fact that they're adults and they know how to play their instruments so much better than what they did when they were younger. But yeah, no, I would agree with you wholeheartedly.
Gotcha. Well, Ray Harkins, this has been absolutely a blast. I've loved spending this part of my Saturday with you. Where can people find you if they want to know your various podcast projects, social media, bands? Promote your stuff. Tell everybody where to find you.
Right, the pluggables, as I like to call them.
Absolutely, man. Say what you got to say. I love it. Tell everybody who you are.
You could on all social media, you can find me just at xpurposex, which has been my online handle since I was 15 years old, and I've just
Wow,
kept
nice.
it incredibly consistent. So yeah, you can find me on any social media portal there, but you can just visit the podcast website 100wordspodcast.com, and that's the number 100. But yeah, those are the easiest ways to find me and interact with me, and we can obviously nerd out about propaganda all day long.
Awesome. Well, Ray Harkins, this has been a real pleasure having you on the show. I love your podcast. Again, I hope everybody will go and check out, especially those episodes with John K. Sampson and Chris Hanna from Propaganda, because that's why everybody's here listening. But your back catalog is absolutely stellar. And I would really encourage people to dig through your entire episode list, because it's just an endless array of resources and fantastic chats. And Ray, I hope that maybe you'll consider coming back on the show another time to maybe talk about another song too, okay?
That is a date, and I have no problem with that. And thanks for doing what you do, dude. Because this beautiful podcast universe can only exist through people who are passionate about stuff, and I love that. So there you go.
Back from square one. Haven't we just begun? If it rang a bell, what is this crystal knocker? What the fuck is your plan? And would you care to expand? 'Cause I don't deny the choice. Magnify you as the voice of anything I've stood for in these past 9 years. I've conquered the nurturing and found that anything conquering is powered looks back by fear, not by fact. And having said that,
Thank you so much to Dr. Lauren Corman and Ray Harkins for hanging out with me. I loved how much clarity Dr. Corman's descriptions were throughout that conversation. So much detail, so many facts, so much stuff to consider. And, that's the kind of conversation, Keith, that I can't believe I get to have regularly when we do this show. It really just blows my mind, the quality of thought and ideas that I get to engage with here. And I've just been feeling so lucky the last couple of days that we have this project. And I'm so lucky as well because I can listen back to a conversation like I had with Lauren or with Ray and learn so much upon re-listening. So, and I mean, God, having Ray on was so cool because I've listened to hundreds of Ray's podcasts on 100 words or less, and have him on our podcast is such a treat. So Keith, what do you think tonight? Want to go ahead and start with the music before we dive into the immense content with the lyrics?
I definitely have more to say about the lyrics, so good idea.
Okay, cool. So the first two songs on this record are so intertwined to me that it's almost impossible to separate them. So seeing, if they were going to play PC Fascist live and then not immediately play Nailing Descartes after it, that would feel so wrong, wouldn't it? So the fact that we're talking about these songs separately almost feels weird to me.
Yeah, there are a lot of grind bands that have songs that are so short, Nauseum or Pig Destroyer, that they play them in clusters. They play 3 or 4 songs in a row that appear side by side on albums because they flow together, and probably it's what the fans are used to hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I did see a couple of videos from the 90s, the late 90s of Propaganda playing Nailing Descartes to the Wall. And the videos that I saw, they did play PC Fascist first, except for there was one that I saw that I watched of them playing this at Gilman Street in about 95. And they started off with, apparently, I'm a PC Fascist. But Chris said, consider someone else, go vegan, or go F yourself. And but then they had a 30-second break before they launched into the first version of the song, Firestorm My Ass. So it was really weird hearing them do both of those spoken lines and then have a massive gap before they launched in the second one. Because it just didn't feel right. You know what I mean?
Just looking around to see if the rest of the band is ready.
Absolutely. So, I got a couple things to say about the music on this one. My favorite thing about this song is Jord.
Oh yeah.
Jord's performance on this song, the fills, the speed, the emulated double bass, with that pounding. I just absolutely love it. like when Chris goes into that meat is still murder part, Jord has such a specific style of emulating double bass without actually using a double kick. And, if you want like a more recent example of how Jord emulates this double kick, you can listen to Failed Imagineer to see that signature approach that is completely interconnected with Jord. He just has like a touch on that double bass emulation style of drumming that's so heavy on that floor tom that is so woven throughout Propagandy's sound. And it just sounds like Propagandy. In so many of Chris's Patreon episodes, he's always talking about how we tried this, but it didn't sound like us.
Right.
And the biggest thing for me for drums for Propagandy is that massive double kick emulation on the floor tom that Jord just brings in. And it's so powerful. And if you put someone else in the band, they would do it, but it would be a noticeable difference. It's like Bad Religion having Bobby Shayer, then Brooks Wackerman, then Jamie Miller on drums, like all good drummers, but all totally noticeable in their differences,
Yeah.
And I even busted out my big drum set today to bash out that closing section just so I could understand what Jord was doing. And I'm not entirely sure how Jord recorded the drum tracks with Ryan Green. It's possible he's playing it all on one floor tom with a really fast right hand. And it's possible he's playing it on two toms with both hands. I'm not entirely sure. So I did a couple different versions. And mind you, I haven't played drums in 6 months. And I didn't warm up at all. But here is my first try on just one floor tom with no rehearsal or a warm up after not playing drums for 6 months. Okay, and here is my second one with two toms played with both arms. So you can see those differences there. So I had a really good time today bashing out some drums. It was a good time.
The cymbals really stand out to me as well. There's so much emphasis and accentuation that Jord brings to just riding on cymbals throughout. And I mean, that's what really I think of. There's not a riff. There's not a particular melody. It's some of the cymbal work that comes to mind if this song starts playing in my head.
I have a little bit of thoughts on the guitars as well. Do you have anything else to say about drums?
No, I'll just say really quickly before you'll share that though, Greg, that I think this song just overall is the closest that comes to the aggression of Rio de San Atlanta.
Oh, nice.
Musically and vocally. PC Fascist even has that melodic, skippy, upbeat punk feel to it, which is great. But the second hint in this like 1-2 punch combo at the beginning of Less Talk, I think this is just so much more hardcore punk. And I think it took me a while to realize how heavy this song really is.
Yeah. And I was watching some drum covers as well. And the people who covered this on drums on YouTube and whatever, they got to go for it, man. This thing this thing shreds. There's no let up on it.
Yeah. And all of the terrible YouTube comments I had to wade through of people basically saying like, oh, great. Well, I'm going to go eat bacon and thinking they're being funny. The one that actually made me the angriest was like making fun of the drumming. I was like, what the hell are you talking about?
That's crazy.
Are you not listening? Yeah, I couldn't believe that. Like of all of the brisket and barbecue and bacon comments, that one by far pissed me off the most.
Oh boy. Yeah. So, this song, I looked up the tabs and everybody knows how great Chris is at guitar, but this song, I looked it up and it just looked so easy and it's a pretty simple tune. And, something that I love doing is when people do covers of the songs for our episodes, that's just such a neat little trick or a neat little characteristic when people add covers to our show. But I busted out my acoustic guitar and just started strumming. And here's a little clip of some of my fumblings earlier today. I also haven't played guitar in over a year, and this is what I managed to do when I was just jacking around in my bedroom earlier. So here's me playing the outro.
Still stupid as anyone, learn all my mistakes. I have recognized a form of oppression, now I recognize the rest. Life's too short to make others shorter.
So that was just a little bit of casual messing about there. So I had a little bit of fun with this one today because it's a tune that I actually was able to string together for a few seconds there. So I had a good time with it. Do you have any other thoughts on the music, Keith?
No, that's really it. It's pretty straightforward. And I really say that in not as a critique. It's just so much more hardcore punk. There's not a whole lot to really to dissect or to break apart. It's a straightforward song that serves its purpose and it backs up the lyrics. And I think I'm ready to dive into some of the ideas if you are.
Nice. Yes. And it gets in and gets out. So we'll dive into lyrics here. So, I absolutely loved that chat that I had with Lauren Corman on the breakdown of the lyrics and the way that she structured that book chapter based on the line by line discussion of that song. So I would definitely encourage everybody out there to go read that book chapter as well. But I got to start with the very beginning of this track. The official beginning is stop consuming animals, which is something I never considered for a long time growing up because the consider someone else of PC fascist and the stop consuming animals of nailing Descartes aren't easily identifiable as being separate tracks when you're like listening to this on the CD in your car, like back in the 90s. But
yeah.
I love that it's so clear, so concise, and like I said earlier, it's literally the talk before the rock. What do you think about that beginning?
Yeah, I agree. I probably for as much as I heard it or even said it going along with it, I didn't really think about it, and I didn't consider what the message was. And as I'll share, it kind of took me a while to get to a point to really critically think about my own choices and actions and my diet, amongst other things.
Tell me what you think about the first line of this song. I speak outside what is recognized as the border between reason and insanity.
I just think every time that someone asks me why I don't eat meat, it makes me think about that. And I give them an honest and measured response. I try to avoid any exaggerations or graphic details. I mean, I just try to speak simply as a person to a person. And I can't tell you, Greg, how many times the immediate reaction is, well, more for me. And now it just makes me want to just like tell people, well, I don't eat meat because I want to make the holidays more awkward for my family. And I like it when strangers judge me because it never becomes a conversation and people instantly almost get defensive or they deflect. And it's no longer just like, well, why did you ask if you're not going to think about or consider or, just accept what my answer is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very fine line for conversations like that. And talking about food is so incredibly personal and challenging because if a person has a diet they adhere to, like vegetarianism or veganism or pescatarianism or ovo-lacto, and they talk to somebody who has a very different diet, so rarely do those people seem to be able to say, hey, that's cool, and walk away.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
For me as a vegetarian, when I succeeded in 2015, after numerous failed attempts at being permanently vegetarian, I decided right away that I would never seek to persuade anybody. And I would never seek to ask somebody to change their plans to fit my choices. So if somebody invites me to lunch and like, hey, you want to go to Denny's? Fine, I'll figure it out. Want to go to a barbecue? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll bring my own Beyond Meat bratwurst. I also tend to avoid talking to other people about food because so often I found myself talking to people who were so inclined to bend over backwards with things like, well, what about, because they were having a hard time not interpreting my choices as an indictment against them personally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, like, I have no interest in changing anyone's mind, but I'll offer ideas and suggestions if people ask. That's what I've loved about some of the emails we've gotten asking for recipe ideas for easy meatless recipes. I think I forgot to respond to one of those. So if you didn't get a response from me with a few cool recipes, let me know. But I love the fact that you post recipes on our Twitter as well.
I am the recipe king at my school. Every time I make something, people are like, "Hey, can you email me that?" And they're like, "Oh, hey, add me to that email."
Nice. And they're meatless, aren't they?
Yeah. So I'm a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. So as I said before, have my own steps that I still want to take to continue to reduce my impact. But even for me in Indiana, it's still being a vegetarian is a little bit oddball. And
Yeah.
my students look at me like I'm from Mars, and they're like, "Wait, you don't eat meat?" And then I always say, like, when they ask me why, like, "Look, I'm not telling you this because I want you to do the same thing or to feel bad about what you do. I'm telling you because you asked. So don't go home and tell your parents that I was lecturing you about meat, because I know that's what's going to happen. So if you can agree to those terms, I'll tell you why I don't eat meat."
Yeah, nice. Well, and so the next line in this song is pretty interesting. It says, "But I consider it a measure of my humanity to be written off by the living graves of 1 billion murdered lives." And I did some digging into some statistics, and 1 billion murdered lives is not even remotely hyperbole. If anything, that's a conservative amount. The United States,
sure. Yeah.
the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, reports that 9.59 billion land animals were slaughtered in 2018, including 9.1 billion chickens.
Yeah.
236 million turkeys, 33 million cattle, 124 million pigs, 27 million ducks, 2.2 million sheep. So when Chris says by the living graves of 1 billion murdered lives, it should be the living graves of billions of murdered lives. And, a website called animalclock.org has a live tracker showing how many animals are killed in the US since the start of the year. And
Oh, wow.
it even tracks. So if you go to the website, animalclock.org, it starts tracking how many animals were killed since you logged on to the website.
Man.
So it says, since you've been on this website, 1,857 animals have been killed. 2,457 animals have been killed. And it tracks in real time. It's really crazy. And another thing that's nuts is that animals get killed and packaged for food, and then American consumers throw away 21.7% of the meat they purchase, needlessly killing billions of animals. We are so careless and craven and rich and spoiled that we often don't even bother to eat the thing that died and got ground up into nuggets that you bought from the freaking Sainsbury's or Wegmans or Publix or Hy-Vee or Safeway, that you get too freezer burned sitting in the bottom of your freezer in a giant bag. And it got to the point to where you couldn't even eat it anymore. And then you were like, oh, well, and you threw it in the trash, and some little thing got ground up in a giant grinding machine that is now just getting thrown away in the garbage.
Greg, that phrase, living graves, is just terrible, but it really perfectly describes factory farming, an existence where meaning and purpose have been replaced with violence and suffering. And although some countries are seeing a decline in meat consumption, including the US, we eat more meat per person than ever before in history. And in the last 50 years, the number of people on the planet has doubled, but the amount of meat that we eat has tripled. And on top of the statistics that you shared, Greg, one that I found that I hadn't even really thought of was numbers that we don't know. So when it comes to seafood, the number of individual fish and shellfish is almost impossible to calculate. So
Yeah.
150 million tons of seafood were produced for human consumption in 2016, which is nearly half from aquaculture, which would be like fish or shrimp farms, rather than caught in fisheries. And I found something called the vegan calculator, and there was a vegetarian tab, and I don't know exactly what metrics it uses to quantify this, but you can type in the amount of time that you've been either vegan or vegetarian. It gives you some statistics. And I've been vegetarian for 11 years, and it estimates that I have therefore not eaten 2,222 animals, and that 17,000 pounds of CO2 have been saved as a result.
Nice. How did you feel when you got those statistics? Did that seem like a lot or a little?
I don't know. I guess I don't really think about it. But I mean, the seeing just in the thousands, and, if you're visiting there's a county park near me where they have farm animals that are just, they're invisible, and there's some horses and cows walking around. And I don't know, you see one or two cows or horses, and then thinking of that number in the thousands, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But yeah, I think it doesn't make me want it wouldn't be the driving force for me to continue being vegetarian, but it definitely feels good to see that, I guess.
Yeah, I picture Chris learning all these things and becoming enraged at humanity. And it reminds me of the next line, and I'm not ashamed of my recurring dreams about me and a gun and a different species of carnage strewn about the stockyards, factories, and farms. So
Yeah.
I went on the website, propaganda.com, and I went to the record and I read the lyrics. And when he has me and a gun and a different species, which that vocal hook is so freaking catchy, by the way, me and a gun, different species. I sang that freaking line all week. But he wrote starts with an H and rhymes with Newman's. So he's saying that me and a gun and a different species, he's talking about killing the people who are perpetuating and inflicting this violence upon helpless creatures, essentially. So that was, sort of a revelation to me that he was talking about killing the people who were responsible for these atrocities. And, much has been said and done in recent years to expose the extreme brutality of mechanical animal industrial slaughter and processing. The amount of horror that goes into getting that sanitized and pretty package of pre-shaped beef patties in like supermarkets around the world could include any number of atrocities.
Yeah.
So for example, according to an NPR article from 2016 that I read today, from 2004 to 2013, 151 meat and poultry workers died from injuries sustained at work. Southern Poverty Law Center records repetitive motion injuries of slaughterhouse workers, and Oxfam reported that many slaughterhouse workers were denied mandatory bathroom breaks and actually wore adult diapers at work. So they're killing animals in repetitive motions in a mechanized building while some of them are peeing their own pants. And it's just such an insanely disgusting visual that I almost I got queasy and nauseous when I was reading it. And The Guardian reported in 2018 from records compiled by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is called OSHA, reveal that on average there are at least 17 severe incidents a month in U.S. meat plants, and these injuries are classified as those involving hospitalizations, amputations, or the loss of an eye. And amputations happen on average twice a week for slaughterhouse workers. So the carnage that Chris writes about in this line isn't even species specific. And
Yeah.
I say all of that as a person who cares about people's lives and animals' lives,
Yeah, for sure. And Chris Deutsch has a book coming up, which if you follow him on Twitter, you might see him make reference to Beeftopia. But he's written already and shared information about how workers have been isolated. Their rights have been taken away. Unions have been disenfranchised. And the people who work in these places are disproportionately poor. They're ethnic minorities, and the way they are treated for the things that we throw away, that we take for granted, that we assume as a right, either because we're American or in the middle class or whatever, come at the cost of other people who oftentimes can't even afford those foods in the first place.
Yeah, and we're still in a pandemic as well. So, in the Economic Policy Institute, I was looking up some statistics because everybody knows about the South Dakota COVID cases from the slaughterhouses from this past spring and summer. And it was reported that one of the most dangerous and exploitative industries in the country, slaughtering and processing of meat, relies, as you just said, heavily upon rural workers, immigrant workers, refugees, people of color who have oftentimes few better options because of like
Yeah.
migrant statuses and things like that. And the Food and Environment Reporting Network, which tracks the spread of COVID in the industry, said that as of September 22nd, at least 42,700 people in 496 meat and poultry plants were infected with COVID, and at least 203 of these workers have died from COVID-19. So, as long as Billy and Susie have their wings, burgers, and brats for the Buffalo Bills game, people can keep getting sent into close quarter work conditions to kill animals and give each other COVID and suffer while we go out inside and grill out during halftime. And I think it's important to realize that every time someone spends their money on a pack of wings, that's what you're playing a role in. And if you know that and you're like, well, okay, that's what I'm playing a role in. I mean, but you must at least consider it. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. And I want to go back to that dream that's mentioned because for the longest time, I misheard the lyric.
Oh,
I actually thought Chris was saying he was the gun in a different species hand. Like there was, this biped cow who had a gun and Chris was the gun and he was using Chris to shoot people in a factory like the animals are. And I'm not joking. And that's how I heard it for a really long time. And it made sense. And I mean, I didn't even see it as being, ridiculous or goofy. I saw it as being like, use me as the weapon. Which I think it was not until just recently I realized in looking at the lyrics that while it's kind of the same idea, it is still pretty different. And I have a hard time thinking a lyric like that would make it on a record, even a punk label today. Chris is putting things on the table, obviously drawing a line, but torpedoing ambiguity and expressing how this struggle seemed to be consuming him at the time. So opposite Chris's fantasy about laying waste to factories and murdering people, this is an act of terrorism. It's important to remember how benign environmentalist activities now constitute actual terrorism. And so Will Potter, the author of Green is the New Black, was arrested in Chicago for hanging door knockers, pamphlets against animal testing. He was later then visited by the FBI, and they said that he would be put on a domestic terrorist list if he didn't help to spy on political activists. So later on, he testified before Congress, pointing out that, going green was marketable. It was a trendy buzzword, but the nonviolent environmental activists were considered to be the nation's greatest domestic terrorist threats. And he argues that despite the popularity universally, not just in the US, but elsewhere, of nonviolent grassroots environmental protests and interruptions, their opponents invented the term eco-terrorist in 1985 to change public perception, as well as to change policing and prosecutions, with major corporations supporting the new laws that equate activism with terrorism if profits are harmed. And I found a description of this law. This is the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. It was in late September 2006. The bill was passed. It passed the House by unanimous consent. Once on the House side, Representative Dennis Kucinich highlighted his concerns. He said that existing laws were already, adequate. You hear that a lot talking about the insurrection at the Capitol right now, and all of these claims to require to have new laws on the books, which of course are just going to be used against activists and leftists and other radicals. Kucinich then went on to say that the bill created a special class of crimes for a specific type of protest, and such a broad terrorist label would harm free speech. And he urged Congress to pay more attention to the issues that were raised by the millions of Americans who were concerned about humane treatment of animals, and to consider legislation in response to those concerns. And of course, despite all this, the bill was pushed through late at night with inadequate notice, either on Capitol Hill or in the media. And it was like single-digit % of members of the House were actually present to vote on it. So the law itself prohibits any person from engaging in certain conduct, quote, for the purpose of damaging or interfering with the operations of an animal enterprise. The statute covers any act that either damages or causes the loss of any real or personal property, or places a person in reasonable fear or injury.
Oh my gosh. Well, I hope Will Potter will consider coming on the podcast sometime, because that is an amazing story. And maybe Dennis Kucinich can come on the podcast too and answer for himself. And I love the idea of you saying that Chris is the weapon, so Chris is writing about essentially being a vigilante to free billions of animals from a grim death at the hands of often oppressed workers, which is another hugely tragic aspect of this story, is the way that human beings are doing this work because of few better options. And, I think knowing the heinous conditions workers are often forced to endure might inform Chris's recurring dream these days as well.
For sure.
So we have this line, still I know as well as anyone that it does less good than harm to be this honest with a conscience eased by lies. Oh man, what a good line. I was chatting with Sue from War on Women recently, and she made a comment that when she and her friends found Propaganda, they weren't all vegan or vegetarian, but they were all like, yeah, that's the right thing to do.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like how so many Propaganda fans listen to these songs for years and years and would immediately leave a show and go to Taco Bell and eat a bunch of chalupas, And so easing oneself into telling the truth about the system that you're a part of is so insanely important, because if you're going to eat animals, but you continue to shield yourself from the gruesome reality of the way your actions, eating habits, and financial decisions contribute to greenhouse emissions, methane, freshwater depletion, death, debarking, declawing, defanging, dehorning, wing clipping, toe cutting, branding, teeth pulling. I mean, you get the point. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. And I have that cognitive dissonance about not being a vegan. So, I mean, I think of people who smoke, who know they're harming themselves and they want to stop, but they can't. And I have no grievance or disagreement with the purposes or the motivations or the foods themselves, that constitute veganism. I just haven't done it. And I am the obstacle. So that's the step that I'm kind of stuck on now. So that totally makes sense. And that's what I've been actually thinking about. I mean, I have the Failed States hoodie on that has animal friendly on the front. And I'm not joking, Greg. I feel like a fake wearing this in a way, because I still, do eat dairy, and I don't abstain from all animal products. And that divide in my head of knowing the reality and seeing the footage and reading the books, but my legs being the weighed down, like they're like having cement shoes on, and me being the reason why I can't take the next step. I think about that on a daily basis.
Yeah. And I have the, I had about a 6 to 8 month flirtation with veganism. And I was cooking vegan at home, and we were eating every meal. And then I found out that I was really the only person in my household who was eating the food. So I would go to this tremendous effort of making like a tofu ricotta for a massive lasagna, and putting this all together and going through all this work. And then I would realize that I was the only person eating it. And so the lack of ability to do it all as a family prevented my progress from being a vegan. And I've done pretty well, but I'm still just vegetarian. I do eat cheese, and I have during that period of veganism, though, I got the Propaganda Vegan Invaders t-shirt.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't wear it. It sits on a shelf because it just doesn't feel right putting that thing on. And it's such a rad shirt too. But there's that, and then there's that next line. But you cannot deny that meat is still murder, dairy is still rape. And I am not a farmer. I am not in the dairy industry. I'm a vegetarian guy with a desk job who doesn't drink milk as a beverage because I think it's weird. I don't use dairy creamer in my coffee because the plant-based milk alternative creamers are easily as good, in my opinion, for coffee. I don't really feel qualified or smart enough to comment on the dairy is still rape line. Sexual assault and violence is something I take extremely seriously as a peace-loving but imperfect person. And the conversation that I had with Lauren Corman, where I asked her about that line, is kind of really all I feel capable of saying at the moment as far as the dairy is still rape line. That is really, really complicated stuff.
I agree, Greg. There's no easy way to talk about this for me as a cis male, as a non-vegan. I'd imagine for some listeners, this line might have made sense and been the final push to help them abstain from dairy or motivating them to continue doing so. But I don't know, there might also be survivors of abuse or sexual violence who hear it differently. And if it served its purpose of shocking people at the time or of kind of jolting them, I don't know. And if the band still thinks this line applies today, I also don't know. But just like the racial epithet in Name and Address, I actually don't sing this line if this when I'm jamming this album. I kind of skip this one, and I just don't say it because I personally don't feel comfortable for those layered reasons singing along with it.
Yeah, and so then there's the line, I'm still as stupid as anyone, but I know my mistakes. And I absolutely love that line because humility and being able to laugh at oneself is such an essential ingredient in what I see as the path to living an examined life. As we go through life year after year, the goal will be to do a little better this year than you did the last year. And the goal is to do a little better next year than you're doing this year. And so knowing our fragility, knowing our weaknesses, knowing our mistakes, owning them, being open-minded to improvement and critique, I just see that as such an essential ingredient of life. And I really love this line. I'm still as stupid as anyone, but I know my mistakes.
Yeah, Greg. And this is the kind of stuff that I think people miss if they have like a fleeting encounter with Propaganda's music, or if they knew them for a little while, or they know someone who listens to them, or they saw them live, but didn't really know them. I think people probably see them as standing on the soapbox of course, the word that everyone uses if you talk about animal rights is going to be preachy anytime you talk about food or an alternative diet. But there are so many of these lines that people miss, and this goes along with it. And I think if the abrasive lyrics about animal liberation are the shot, this is the chaser to say like, hey, I'm just a person and I'm still trying to figure it out too. And I think it for me, it smooths it out. It takes off a little bit of the edge. And not that I don't take it so seriously or think that the other things that are said aren't as important, but I realize that there's someone who's still struggling as well. And I don't see, therefore, these ideas that I'm confronting through their music and liner notes and shows and YouTube videos, that it's not being preached to, but it's in the aim, I think, more is of a conversation.
Yeah, and I really love the line, "I've recognized one form of oppression, now I
Mhm.
recognize the rest." Like this song, I mean, these lyrics are amazing. All the
Oh
way
yeah.
through every line, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I love that line. Oh, I love that line too." And if someone cares about LGBTQIA plus rights or women's rights and feminism, racial equity, racial equality, refugee rights, ability status rights, and feels pain at the oppression of any of these groups, but looks upon an animal industrial complex slaughterhouse and feels nothing and shrugs the shoulders. I feel like that's what Chris is getting at here. Like, look, everybody, you care about all of these things. Why don't you care about this one too? Please consider caring about it. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And this is easily my favorite lyric in the entire song. And it's also the line that has had me thinking the most this week, and also thinking about the song differently in a new way than I had, in the last, whatever, 15 years of me owning this album. And also my diet, thinking about my own diet differently. And I stumbled upon a zine in the anarchistlibrary.org.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's
I love when you sent me that.
Yeah, it's called Nailing Descartes to the Wall, Animal Rights, Veganism, and Punk Culture, written by Len Tilburger and Chris P. Kale. And so I thought it was going to have recipes and maybe some band descriptions, resources for activists and outreach, but it's really written more like a scholarly article. It's
Mhm.
not really a zine. I mean, if it was made as a zine in a DIY style and then put together on their own and distributed at shows, but the format itself is definitely an article that examines the intersections of capitalism, animal rights, anarchism, the punk scene, amongst other economic and social factors. And related to what you said, Greg, if anyone is unfamiliar with the term intersectionality, it was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And the purpose is to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and they overlap. So, for example, last fall, when my students compared and contrasted the lives of women in the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish North American colonies, we understood that there's no singular monolithic women's history. There's no single narrative that tells the lives of all the women in a particular place. You have to look at class, gender identity, race, the lives of indigenous women, freed and enslaved women between these different places to make a more nuanced and a complete picture. So, reading this article, Greg, I really thought a lot about my own vegetarianism and how, in many ways, it stands alone. It's not really tethered to any other form of action. And it made me question whether or not my vegetarian diet is actually activism or resistance, or if it's really just another form of consumption. And that made me think about some other things. So, like, what do I think about vegetarian and vegan options at fast food chains and restaurants? I mean, is it better because there are more options? Does it help to normalize meat-free diets by making some foods more accessible? Or is it just another form of consumerism because ultimately it puts more wealth into the hands of a very exclusive group of people? And am I disrupting the system of violence that abuses animals if I buy a tofurkey from a place like Whole Foods? So
Mm.
you shared some really important details about the impact on people as well, working in factory farming in the meat industry. I think I read that 87% of meatpacking workers infected with COVID have been racial and ethnic minorities, according to the CDC. But
Ugh.
I spent a lot of time pondering about my own diet. So, like, although meat free, I still don't know enough about where my money is going.
Yeah.
And although I don't eat at fast food chains, I don't shop at Whole Foods. I eat at restaurants that do profit from cruelty. And I can't help but think that I'm motivated more by trying some new, faux meat stand-in product than actually maximizing the impact of the money I spend or I don't spend. So I don't know. I feel committed, obviously, to maintaining being vegetarian, but I realize now that the diet itself has been like a singular plot point, and I
Mm.
need to consider some other factors if my diet is going to mean something more.
Yeah, and I have to say, on trips and things like that, or driving around, like I have popped into Burger King this
Mhm.
year and gotten that Impossible Whopper.
Yeah.
I've done it several times, and I go to Taco Bell and I get that cheesy bean and rice burrito, or I get the vegan Crunch Wrap Supreme, and my money's going to Taco Bell. My money's going to Burger King.
Yeah.
And another thing that you just brought up was something that just sprang to mind was on my other podcast. I one time interviewed Eric Repair, who is a super world famous travel TV show host. He was Anthony Bourdain's best friend, but he owns a Michelin star restaurant in Manhattan. And I interviewed him for the other podcast, and he's a Buddhist. And I was asking him about the Buddhist precept of right livelihood. And I said, so, if you serve alcohol in a restaurant, like you're potentially perpetuating a person's alcoholism and suffering, and you benefit off of their suffering. Or if you serve meat or in your restaurant, you are causing the death and destruction of a living sentient being oftentimes, and then you are profiting off of that death of that sentient being. And it was such an interesting conversation to hear this incredibly thoughtful person, Eric Repair, talk about his perceptions of the industry that he has been a part of his whole entire life and how he navigates those conflicts as a practicing Buddhist. But that was sort of a tangent. But that Nailing Descartes to the Wall pamphlet that you mentioned, I just looked it up online, and I just found a hard copy listed online for $980 plus $3.99 shipping. So I just found that hard copy. So definitely go to the website version. What was it, on Anarchist Library?
Yeah. We could include it in the show notes.
Nice. We should do that. So do you have any thoughts on the closing line of this song? Life's too short to make others shorter.
There was never any single lyric from a band, a particular song that kind of flipped the switch for me. I think the one thing that does come to mind in terms of like really cementing my commitment to being a vegetarian was actually reading something from the singer of Cattle Decapitation, Travis Ryan, who said something so simple, and it just resonated even for me as a dumb, selfish college kid. He said something like, I want to be able to spend $5 and it not come at the cost of something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just so simple, and it kind of cut through all of my whatabouts that I would say to people if they told me they were a vegetarian, or I can't, or all of my but statements. And that's what comes to mind when I think about that I want to try to do my best to lessen the suffering, and I could do a better job now. And if you want to take some more steps, Greg and I, we of course have resources, and we have some experience. And if you want to encourage Greg and myself to take even more steps, well, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, and I actually want to give a shout out to a couple of recipe ideas. We have a listener named Joe who puts the most insane vegan recipes and delights on his Instagram page, and his Instagram is @draggedthroughthegarden, and his website is draggedthroughthegarden.net. highly recommend checking out Joe's vegan recipes. He's really working hard to put some cool stuff together. And some other books that I use that I've had a lot of luck with are America's Test Kitchen Vegan.
Oh,
It's a great book.
that's like the only TV show I watch.
Oh yeah, they have a vegan book. They have a vegetarian book. It's
I
wonderful.
didn't know that.
They're
Awesome.
great. There's also an Italian vegan cookbook called Chloe Coscarelli's Vegan Italian. There's a book that I have about bowls, meals and bowls called Vegan Bowls, which is wonderful. And I also have this really wild and huge book called Passionate Vegetarian by the energetically named Crescent Dragonwagon, who is a really well-known food writer. So I just recommend taking some time, researching some new books, finding some cool stuff, and, trying out a few new things, just give it a shot. It's just something that you can never learn too much about. And life is short, and I hope that everybody will try giving something new. But Keith, we have to talk about the other version of this song.
Firestorm.
Firestorm my ass. And I'm just gonna, start off by saying that I like the Nailing Descartes to the Wall version a lot better.
Same.
But Firestorm my ass is the first version of Descartes recorded by Propaganda in their first attempt to record Less Talk More Rock with Ryan Green, in an attempt that yielded only 4 recorded songs. And had that recording not failed, Firestorm My Ass would be the song that everybody would know to this day who cared about Propaganda. And this probably would have been the version of the song that appeared on whatever record those sessions would have yielded. So for those of you who don't know this song, Firestorm My Ass, you can find it on YouTube. It was also on the Where Quantity is Job Number 1 G7 compilation from Propaganda in 1998. But it is a rebuke, a retort, if you will, against Earth Crisis's legendary Firestorm. So there's Earth Crisis Firestorm and Propaganda's Firestorm My Ass. So here's the lyrics of Firestorm My Ass. Heard a song and I counted out loud the 2 steps, the goose steps back from square one, from where we'd just begun, and then it rang a bell. But is this crystal knocked, or what the fuck is your plan? Would you care to expand? And I don't deny the choice, but I defy you as the voice of anything I've stood for in these past 9 years. I've conquered the nurturing and found that anything worth conquering is powered, built, and backed by fear, not by fact. And having said that, so the alternate version appears on the Where Quantity is Job Number 1 comp. And, they were playing this live in 1995 in the version that would go on the original recording session. So for example, here is a snippet from 1995 at Gilman Street with the alternate version being performed.
Hit it. Hit it. Hit it. Heard a song and I counted out loud. Cause that's two steps back from square one. And we just begun. And then it rang a bell. But is this crystal knocked, or what the fuck is your plan? Would you care to expand? Cause I don't deny the choice. I defy you as the voice of anything I've stood for in this past 9 years. I conquered the measuring. I found that anything conquering is coming back. Fuck you. By fear, not by fact. And having said that,
So that's a little tiny clip of Propaganda playing this song in 1995. And you can hear that it's essentially the same song, but that it got reworked after it was recorded the first time. So what do you think about Firestorm My Ass so far?
I do really, well, obviously I like the Less Talk version more. So, but I also have to say that I love how if it did make it onto the album, they would have been just going after everybody and everything. And to call out straight edge bands like that in the 90s,
Yeah.
that's you don't do that. Like, that's pretty brave. And so in that way, I kind of wish it made it on, because, I'm not the biggest Earth Crisis fan. I've listened to a few albums, but Propaganda doesn't have a new metal album like Earth Crisis does.
Hmm.
So one of them has aged better, the music itself, but also the, I don't know, the intellectual or emotional level of the language. And with bands like that, in that zine that I mentioned, one of the comments and one of the conclusions that it makes is that policing vegetarianism and veganism in the punk scene pushed people away. And that attempt to force alternative diets onto people was actually harmful in spreading and sharing animal rights and animal liberation content and ideas and resources. And rather, that punk itself ultimately strives to be, a community and supportive. So when there aren't those policing behaviors, it's able to like bring people together, whether they were punk and now they're also finding out about animal rights, or whether they already knew about animal rights and then they're finding about punk. That if it's not aggressive and it's not connected to or anchored to self-righteousness or just a single-minded approach, that messages are more likely to be accepted, and people are more likely to internalize things.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I like Nailing Descartes to the Wall better than Firestorm Mask, but I'm so friggin' glad that both versions exist.
Right.
And other people are too. Like I was looking at on Patreon with Chris Hanna's Patreon, and one of the patrons, Drew, wrote, "Firestorm My Ass was a much needed critique of the militant vegan straight edge Victory Records scene, and really helped my young brain make important distinctions." And I was thinking about such an impressionable age, being a teenager and wanting so badly to fit in, and the extreme over the top visual imagery of Firestorm's lyrics. I mean, it's so important that this sort of comeback exists. So I mean, listen to these lyrics. So these are the lyrics from Earth Crisis's Firestorm. This is intense stuff. So here it goes: street by street, block by block, taking it all back. The youth immersed in poison, turn the tide, counterattack. Violence against violence. Let the roundups begin. A firestorm to purify the bane that society drowns in. No mercy, no exceptions. A declaration of total war. So yeah, that's like about killing people and waging war in neighborhoods. And that is scary, man. Like, and I think about all the 14, 15, 16-year-olds who were just, who would have been like bowing down to the lyrics in this song. And I mean, it's just, it is scary stuff, and I'm just going to say also that I was never really a huge Earth Crisis fan. Like people at shows wearing Earth Crisis long sleeves and bandanas and who were doing hardcore mosh, like legitimately scared me. Like I was I was a skinny little nerd on the swim team who wore Speedos 5 days a week. And I saw too many fights at VFW Hall hardcore shows to know that I wanted no particular part of that scene. And I know it was probably just a few people, but the seriousness those folks, exhibited in person and the moshing I never took part in were super scary to me. But Earth Crisis is such a well-known vegan straight edge band, and Firestorm was such a big deal in the scene at the time that they became a vocal part of 1993 and 1994 in hardcore. And so it was really important that Chris condemned the visuals of rounding up an execution style war portrayed in the song. I just think that that's so important. Like he asked for clarification. He asked for a step-by-step plan. What is Earth Crisis's plan?
Yeah.
The imagery of the Earth Crisis version is so terrifying that if you really take it literally and visualize it, and knowing that scores of impressionable teenagers were in love with Firestorm, it seems like Carl and the crew could possibly unleash something they couldn't control. You know what I mean? Like, I would never say, oh yeah, they're like totally going to like lead the violence themselves. But if you like open the lid, you open the box and you let out something, I mean, you don't know what the consequences are going to be, you know?
I don't think it's ever good to weaponize rhetoric or
Yeah.
to weaponize a belief system or an ideology. And the fact that propaganda for me has, for lack of a better term, humanized it. The fact that I hear someone struggling with ideas, or that I see people, or I hear people often when they're talking about animals,
Mhm.
that they've humanized animals in a way that I think is effective in again getting me to think about what I do or don't do. I don't know. I'm just not really into the macho warfare language.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
thank you.
And it appears the block by block roundups didn't manifest, thank goodness. I was trying to find some examples of reported and confirmed violence, and I found a Los Angeles Times article called The Twisted World of a Straight Edge Gang from 1998. So if you just search online, the Los Angeles Times, The Twisted World of a Straight Edge Gang, the article will pop right up, and maybe you won't get paywalled from it. The article preview calls them suburban terrorists. And in the article, a high school resource police officer is quoted as saying, "It's the darndest thing I've ever seen. We only have about 100 edgers out of a total student body of 2,100 students, but they're predatory, travel in packs, and go out of their way to fight. Their weapon of choice is pepper mace, which they spray at each other for laughs. Now they're immune to the stuff, which makes it hard on us when there's a gang fight. I've hosed them down with mace, and they just kept on fighting." And taking into consideration that is a police officer saying that about high school students. But that quote, that's a pretty interesting visual as well. But
I'm going to quote you quoting Stripes the other day. Lighten up, Francis.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was against Josh Hawley, man, that guy. But then Chris concedes in the lyrics to agree where they agree.
Yeah.
And having said that, meat is still murder. And he goes into the rest of the song. So he condemns what he doesn't agree with, and he says, "You're not going to be the spokesperson of this thing that I've committed my life to. This is not the correct way of going about it. But having said that, we are both on the side of animal welfare, and we need to maybe it's a call to unity in a way. You know what I mean? Like, if you can tone down what you got going on over here with your street by street, block by block, let the roundups begin stuff, maybe we can work together for a better world." You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And lastly on that, the phrasing on the Nailing Descartes version to me is just better, where it transitions into the meat is still murder part. So the Firestorm version, the lyrics read, "I've conquered the nurturing and found that anything worth conquering is powered, built, and backed by fear, not by fact. And having said that, meat is still murder." In the Descartes version, the lyrics read, "Still I know as well as anyone it does less good than harm. To be dishonest with a conscience eased by lies, you cannot deny that meat is still murder." And I don't like the use of conquered and conquering in the Firestorm version, separated by just a few words. I like the rhyme between lies and deny more than the rhyme between fact and that, because that is a super vague word and I don't really care for it. But I think just the phrasing is stronger in the Descartes version and a more skilled execution of the line. Do you have a preference on the lyrics?
As I said, I think that was a great comment. I'm just glad they both exist, because they serve slightly different purposes.
Yeah.
And I obviously wasn't listening to them when Firestorm, or when Let's Talk would have dropped. But I appreciate that they're willing to call them out. And I mean, you stick "my ass" at the end of pretty much any phrase, and it takes the wind out of it,
Yeah. And I really appreciate this retort by Propaganda in his lyrics, because if Earth Crisis is going to be the most well-known vegan band, just before Propaganda became super well-known and Propaganda got recognized in the music scene as vegans, there's not a whole lot of animal stuff on how to clean everything. So Let's Talk More Rock really brings them into that realm and then into that discussion. and they could get lumped into the militant aspects of veganism. So
Right.
Chris was very, very verbal from the stage back then as well, and was frequently spouting off to the crowd. Like if you go track down that 95 Gilman Street audio, which is on YouTube, and which I've posted on Twitter, you can hear just how saucy Chris could be from the stage, but pepper throughout the insults and FUs, Chris frequently begs people to just learn more. Chris would say stuff from the stage, get a cheer, and say, if you're cheering, are you wearing leather? Which he then calls a euphemism for flesh, which is just so awesome because he has such a way of challenging our hypocrisies back then straightforwardly, but then asking us to look inward at ourselves, which never, while never subjecting another person to physical violence at his hands for making different choices than him. And obviously, I don't really know the guy. I don't know Chris very well. I've chatted a little bit here and there with him, but I don't know what kind of fights he was in back then, but it seems Chris's approach was always a more humorous effort to educate and ask us to consider new ideas as opposed to beating it into us, which is what Firestorm seems to be advocating for. And hilariously, I also came across a Geraldo Rivera Fox News clip from 2005 where vegan straight edge was categorized as a gang in Nevada, and I laughed pretty hard at that. So I also agree that I'm glad that both versions exist. I like how Descartes stands up today as a big picture song about one person's struggle to understand depression of all sentient beings, and not just like a snapshot of a moment in time about Earth crisis, because I think the song has aged way better with the second version,
Right. That's a great point.
Yeah. So do you have any, did you find any good YouTube comments about this song?
Yeah, I found a couple. One said vegan for life, 18 years and counting. This band had always been a huge influence and inspiration to me. One of the best bands of all time in my eyes.
I found one on a YouTube page from a page called Matt Wilson Drummer. And I found Matt Wilson Drummer's channel because he has rad drum covers on his YouTube page, and he did a playthrough of Descartes. And he wrote on the comments, I recently did a drum cover of this song on my channel and used it to announce I have been meat-free this year. Now I just get hassled by family, friends, and coworkers. I'm still surprised that other people care so much about what I choose to eat or not eat. What else did you find?
One was just a quote from J.H. Kellogg. It said, "A dead cow or sheep lying in the pasture is recognized as carrion. The same sort of carcasses dressed up and hung up in a butcher's stall passes as food."
Another user wrote, "Meat is murder, period, end of story. To argue that fact is to outwardly admit stupidity, and that's all there is to it. You can argue what is natural to our species and defend your dietary preference all day, but taking the life of an animal is and always will be just as meaningful as taking the life of a human. No human gets to decide that only our species can be murdered, least of all some dude commenting on a YouTube video. Earth decides in the end. We're all nothing." And another one wrote, I was vegan for a while up until recently. Then I started eating people, only free range, of course, which is humane. I gave them a little space, didn't terrorize them, then slit their throats. And then
Did Chris write that?
Maybe, you never know. And then another one said goosebumps every time, which is pretty cool. So what is your big takeaway lesson from this track?
Well, I think about something just recently that I listened to. One of our listeners shared with us on Twitter a podcast from Pod Minutes to Cast Night, the show by the folks who make 2 Minutes to Late Night. And the episode was like a 5 songs or less. The co-host gave Jordan Olds, aka Arsenio Hall, a copy of Today's Empires, since it was one of his favorite albums and he really wanted to turn him onto it. And he was familiar with some of the later Propaganda stuff, but not this album. And I like that I got to hear someone talk about the band from a different perspective. And Jordan Guarcinio said that he didn't really see people having their minds changed by Propaganda's lyrics. And sure, there are a ton of trolling bait comments on YouTube. As I mentioned before, everything about bacon. And I'm 100% sure that in between songs, there are hecklers in the 90s were even worse than the YouTube comments. But I can't even begin to measure how many people have shared a lyric, a song, a specific album, or a liner note from Propaganda that did, in fact, change their lives. So, Greg, my point is that, yeah, it's true. Propaganda didn't change my mind about like vegetarianism. That had to happen through interpersonal connections, and it happened to happen like it had to happen really slowly and with waxing maturity. So, this song, Nailing Descartes, or Purina, or Potemkin City Limits, didn't make me want to throw in the towel and stop eating meat. But I think what's even more important is they've kept me from eating meat. And in this weird little podcast community, many of our listeners have provided a sense of community and support, sharing their stories and their recipes. And they also provide something to strive for, as I realize my own dietary commitments aren't enough. And there's one last thing I want to read from that zine that I mentioned. There's a quote here. It says, "Consider the myriad behaviors that are culturally specific to contemporary capitalism. Behaviors that, for example, are simply accepted as ways of life, as normal. If veganism were to become a normative value in mainstream hegemonic society, then people would just be vegan. They might not ever agonize over the ethics of consuming another living creature, but the suggestion to do so would seem preposterous."
Well said across the board. For me, Propaganda have always been honest, blunt, unafraid, unapologetic. They wore their hearts on their sleeves. They spoke their truth live, loudly from the stage. They wrote songs they believe in, even in the face of taunts from people who literally paid money to watch them, which I find hilarious.
Yeah.
And the impact this band has made over so many years is vast. And you know what? So is the influence of Earth Crisis as well. And it just goes to show that if you speak your truth of something you hold a conviction on and weather any storms that come your way, history has a tendency to shine pretty brightly on those folks. And I keep thinking back on some of these old songs where Chris sort of like through the lyrics asks me to look inward, examine myself, observe my behaviors, seek to do better each day, and challenge myself to really live through actions, the convictions that my mind is convinced of. Like if I'm convinced of it, I should do it through action.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that to me is what this song is about. Live an examined life. When I make a mistake, admit it and seek to do a little better the next sun up to sundown. And every year going vegetarian and vegan gets easier and more convenient as businesses realize they're missing out on a growing share of the consuming public's dollars. You know, without these trailblazers in vegan awareness, like Propaganda, like Davey and AFI, Russ and Good Riddance, Earth Crisis, who knows if places like freaking Burger King would even be investing in plant-based burgers right now. And so that's just something that I'm thinking about today. So should we go ahead and rate this? Because this is going to be a crazy long episode at this point.
Yeah, Greg, I think Nailing Descartes is a really effective animal liberation song. I think it's in and out in 65 seconds, and in doing so, it's successful. It conveys the band's anger and their frustration, which can't be ignored if someone is really listening. And if the people aren't really listening, the message is still impossible to ignore, which I love. So I'm going to give this a 3.5.
So I'm going to take the piss on myself for a second here for all of our UK listeners. So this is a totally awesome song, but I was going through the record and there are 6 songs on this album that I like more than this song, if you can believe it. But our ranking system, I'm now convinced, sucks.
Yeah, it's
frankly.
not good.
It's
not
stupid.
good.
This is so dumb. I can't even believe we're still doing this. So I gave Resisting Tyrannical Government a 3. I gave People's History a 3.75. And I like Resisting Tyrannical Government more than Nailing Descartes to the Wall. And I gave that one a 3. So I like Resisting Tyrannical Government more than this song, which means I have to then rank this one lower. And I suck at ranking songs. And I want to say how dumb I think my own rankings now are after being almost 40 episodes into this thing. But since I gave Resisting Tyrannical Government a 3 and I like that one more than this, that means I have to give this one a 2, which is bonkers. So I'm giving it a 2, but I recognize that it makes no sense that I'm giving it a 2 but maybe it does since it's a minute long, and maybe I'm left wanting more. Maybe it feels slightly incomplete. Who knows? But I'm giving it a 2, even though I hate myself for it. So, all of that said, dear listeners, friends out there, that is our episode on nailing Descartes to the wall, meat is still murder, / Firestorm my ass. I hope you liked the sort of 2-in-1 nature of discussing a song that's only 64 or 65 seconds long. I'm sure this is an insanely long episode by the time I edit it. But if you want to find us, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at propagandipod. You can email us at propagandipod@gmail.com. Thank you so much again to Dr. Lauren Corman and Ray Harkins for being our guests on probably the longest episode ever. And this has been a real thrill. So Keith, thanks for hanging out with me this week.
Yeah, Greg, it was good to chat.
And we'll see you next time.
America rules. America rules. America rules. America rules. America rules. America rules. What? Fuck you, asshole.
Nice shot. Oh,
Fuck
I
you,
like that.
asshole. Fuck you.
You're really cool.
Fuck you.
Give me a big kiss.
Yeah, this world is fucking doomed with this is like the fucking cross section of the assholes that this world has to deal with.